My name is Elena Marchetti. I am 34 years old, and at 6:47 p.m. on a Saturday in July, I watched a woman named Vanessa Cole marry my brother in a $9,000 dress I quietly helped pay for, without her ever knowing my signature was on the wire transfer. 3 weeks earlier, that same woman had looked my 68-year-old father in the eye and said, about the plane tickets my parents were never given to fly to Hawaii for that wedding, if they want to go, they can swim there. I remember exactly how the light hit her diamond earrings when she said it, because I was the one who paid for those earrings too, through an invoice she thought came from her mother. I did not raise my voice. I did not cry. I looked at her and said, "Okay, understood." She smiled, thinking she had won something. She had no idea what she had just started. If you are watching this from a family group chat you had to mute to stay sane, type your city below, then like and subscribe. Because by the end of this video, you are going to want to know exactly how a woman with a calculator and a grudge can end a wedding before the cake is even cut. 3 things were happening at once that summer, and I want you to understand all 3 before I tell you how they collided, because none of them make sense alone. The first was money. For 14 months, I had been quietly tracing a hole in my brother Daniel's real estate holding company, Marchetti Coastal Ventures, a hole that had started as a rounding error and grown into something closer to $940,000. I am a forensic accountant. I built my career finding exactly this kind of hole for other people's families, for law firms, for the SEC referrals nobody wanted to touch, and I had spent 4 months telling myself it wasn't my business, until the night I found my own parents' retirement account listed as collateral on a loan document I was never supposed to see. The second was betrayal, and this one was smaller and uglier and closer to home than the money. My brother's best man and business partner, a man named Marcus Webb, had been sleeping with the wedding coordinator, a 26-year-old named Chloe Renner, since February, 4 months before he stood beside Daniel at the altar and called Vanessa the best thing that ever happened to this family. I found out by accident, the way you find out most things that ruin your week, a text notification lighting up a borrowed phone at exactly the wrong angle. The third was the plan, the part I am not going to tell you yet, except to say that by the time Vanessa Cole walked down that aisle in Maui, I already knew 3 federal agents would be within 400 feet of the reception tent, and none of them were my guests. I need to back up because none of this makes sense unless you understand what our family actually looked like versus what it was. To the outside world, the Marchettis were an American success story with a slightly uneven finish. My father, Robert Marchetti, spent 31 years as a machinist at a tool and die plant in Ohio before it closed in 2009, and my mother, Diane, ran the front desk at a pediatric dental office for 26 years. They were not wealthy. They were careful. They paid off a modest 3-bedroom house in Dayton by the time they were 55, they drove the same Buick for 11 years, and they raised 2 kids who went in almost opposite directions. I went into numbers. I got a partial scholarship to Ohio State, worked 2 jobs through undergrad, and clawed my way into a forensic accounting track that eventually landed me a position at Harrow & Vance, a boutique financial investigations firm in Chicago that big law firms called when they needed someone who could find fraud that had been dressed up to look like a normal balance sheet. By 32, I was a senior manager pulling $210,000 a year plus bonuses, quietly, without a single public post about it, because the nature of my work meant discretion wasn't optional, it was survival. Nobody at a barbecue in Dayton would have guessed what I did for a living. I liked it that way. My brother Daniel went the other direction. He was 2 years older, gregarious, effortlessly likable in the specific way that makes people assume competence is attached to charisma. And by 29, he had branded himself as a real estate visionary with a company called Marchetti Coastal Ventures, headquartered, at least on paper, in a shared office space in Newport Beach. He posted drone footage of properties he described as under contract, that were, more often than not, properties he had merely toured with a broker. He wore a Rolex Submariner that I happened to know, because I had reviewed his credit report during an argument 2 years earlier when he needed a cosigner, was purchased on a store credit card with a 31% interest rate he had not paid off in 18 months. What almost nobody knew, what I only learned in stages over 4 years, was that Daniel's actual business was propped up by 3 things: a series of increasingly reckless bridge loans, a rotating cast of investors he brought in through charm and PowerPoint decks, with numbers that did not reconcile, and me. Specifically, $180,000 I had wired him in increments between 2021 and 2024, framed each time as a short-term bridge that would be repaid the moment a deal closed, and which I stopped tracking as a loan and started quietly writing off in my head as the cost of keeping my parents from finding out their golden child was underwater. I want to be precise about why I did that, because it matters later. It was not blind loyalty. I loved my brother the way you love someone you grew up sharing a bathroom with. A love with calluses on it, worn down by 20 years of watching him get away with things I never could have. But the real reason I kept bailing him out was my parents. My father had a heart attack in 2019, mild, survivable, but it left him with a fear of stress that manifested as a fear of bad news. Any bad news. About anyone. My mother had spent her whole life being told, gently but constantly, that Daniel was sensitive and needed protecting, while I was told I was strong and could handle things. I had internalized that division so completely that by the time I was 30, I genuinely believed my role in the family was to be the load-bearing wall nobody had to think about, the one who absorbed pressure so the visible parts of the house stayed pretty. Vendetta Cole entered the picture in the fall of 2022, at a charity gala in Newport Beach, that Daniel had talked his way into attending as a sponsor, a title that, I later confirmed through a donor list I was not supposed to have access to, cost him $4,000 he did not have. Vanessa was 28 then, the daughter of Patricia and Gerald Cole, a family with genuine old money on her father's side, the kind that owned a marina in San Diego and a house in Rancho Santa Fe that had been photographed for a regional lifestyle magazine twice. Vanessa herself did not work in any conventional sense. She described herself on social media as a lifestyle curator and philanthropic consultant, a title that, as far as I could ever determine through 6 months of quiet due diligence I ran on my own family, the way I would run it on a stranger, corresponded to no actual income, no LLC, no client list, nothing but a blue checkmark and 41,000 followers. They got engaged 11 months later, at a resort in Cabo San Lucas that Daniel put on a card that was already 60% utilized, and I remember exactly where I was when my mother called to tell me, standing in the kitchen of my Lincoln Park apartment at 9:14 on a Tuesday night, her voice so full of relief and joy that I did not have the heart to ask a single one of the 14 questions already lining up in my head. I said congratulations. I meant it, for my mother's sake, if nothing else. I did not yet know what Vendetta Cole would say about my parents 9 months later, standing in a kitchen of her own, 3,000 miles from mine, certain that no one who mattered was listening. The engagement party was held in April of 2024 at the Cole family's house in Rancho Santa Fe, and it was the first time I understood, in my body, and not just in spreadsheets, what kind of family my brother was marrying into. The house sat on 4 acres behind a gate with a call box shaped like a seashell, and the party itself had a hired string quartet, a raw bar flown in from Santa Barbara that morning, and valet parking for 41 cars, 3 of which, I noticed while waiting for my own keys, were rentals with dealer plates still on them. Patricia Cole, Vanessa's mother, greeted me at the door with a hug that lasted exactly as long as it took her to glance over my shoulder to see who else had arrived. Patricia was 59, silver blonde, and had perfected a particular tone of voice, warm on the surface and utterly without warmth underneath, that she used exclusively on people she had already decided did not matter. Elena, right? Danny's sister, the accountant. She said the word accountant the way some people say dog groomer, pleasant, slightly diminishing, filed under service industry. Within the first 10 minutes of that party, I watched Patricia ask 3 different caterers to remake dishes that were, by any reasonable standard, correct, simply because she wanted to watch someone scramble on her behalf. That was Patricia's trait, and it never wavered across the 11 months I knew her. Entitlement so total, she did not experience it as entitlement. She experienced it as the natural order of things being temporarily correctably disrupted. Vanessa's older sister, Brooke Cole Amaya, 29 at the time and recently separated from a husband who had, according to gossip I was not seeking out but could not avoid at a party like that, lost his patience with her spending, found me by the dessert table 40 minutes in. Brooke had the specific energy of a person constantly auditing a room for what could be extracted from it. She told me within 90 seconds of introducing herself, in talks to be maid of honor, which honestly should come with a stipend at this point. Weddings are basically unpaid influencer work now. And then, without transition, asked whether I had connections at any firms that did brand partnerships for finance content, because she was thinking of starting something. I said I mostly worked in forensic accounting, which involved finding money that had disappeared, not helping it appear. She laughed like I had made a joke. I had not. Marcus Webb, Daniel's business partner and eventual best man, I met properly for the first time that night, though I had seen his name on enough Marchetti Coastal Ventures documents to feel like I already knew him. Marcus was 36, tall, with the kind of tan that comes from sitting by pools rather than working near them, and he spent most of the party doing what I would come to understand was his primary professional skill. Standing near my brother during conversations with potential investors, nodding at the right moments and occasionally saying, "That's the vision," in a voice pitched for credibility, while contributing, as far as I could ever determine from 6 years of bank records I eventually subpoenaed through channels I will get to, almost nothing to the actual operations of the company. Marcus's fixed trait, the one that never once cracked in 11 months, was a kind of profitable laziness, an ability to attach himself to other people's effort and claim proportional credit while doing the least possible amount of verifiable work. And then there was Vanessa herself, who I want to describe carefully, because it would be easy and lazy to make her a cartoon, and she was not a cartoon, she was worse, she was completely coherent within her own logic. Vanessa believed, with total sincerity, that she had been born into a tier of person that other people existed to serve, accommodate, or admire, and that this was not arrogance but simply an accurate reading of the facts as she understood them. She was beautiful in an expensive, maintained way, 29 years old, with a laugh that could fill a room and a way of touching your forearm when she talked to you that made you feel, for exactly as long as her hand was there, like the most important person she had spoken to all day. My mother adored her within 20 minutes of meeting her. My father called her a real firecracker and meant it as the highest compliment in his vocabulary. I watched her work that party like a stage, and I watched Daniel watch her work it, glowing with the specific pride of a man who believes a beautiful, socially fluent woman choosing him is a referendum on his own worth, evidence that overrides every red flag his business partner should have been raising and wasn't. I did not dislike Vanessa at the engagement party. I want to be honest about that, because the story that follows only means something if I am honest about where it started. I thought she was self-absorbed and a little cruel to service staff in a way that made my stomach tighten, the way she once sent back a past appetizer without looking at the server who was holding it, addressing the tray instead of the person. But I did not yet know what she would say about my parents. I did not yet know she would call my 68-year-old father, a man who worked a lathe for 3 decades so his children could have braces and college tuition, someone who could swim to Hawaii. That sentence was still 14 months away. What I knew, standing in that backyard holding a glass of champagne I wasn't really drinking, was a smaller, quieter fact, one that would not have meant anything to anyone else in that yard. I knew, because I had pulled it 2 days earlier during due diligence I told myself I was doing just to be thorough, before my brother married into this family, that the Cole family's visible wealth was resting on a foundation nearly as unstable as my brother's. Gerald Cole's marina business had refinanced twice in 3 years. Patricia's charity board seats, 6 of them, generated exactly 0 income and cost. Based on donation records I found through public 990 filings, roughly $40,000 a year in membership contributions the family could not obviously afford. Brooks' divorce settlement, still being litigated, had frozen a significant portion of what should have been liquid Cole family assets. I remember standing there thinking, with the specific cold clarity that has both helped and hurt me my whole life, that I was watching 2 families who had built parallel, unrelated houses of cards, about to merge them into one very large, very public house of cards, and that eventually, someone was going to have to be in the room when it fell. I did not know that someone would be me. I did not know I would be the one holding the match. The wedding was set for July 19th, at a resort on Maui called the Pohaku Point Estate, an oceanfront property that ran, according to the invoice Daniel accidentally left open on a shared cloud drive I still had access to from when I helped him set up his company's bookkeeping in 2021. $138,000 for the venue alone, before catering, before the 17-piece string and brass ensemble Vanessa insisted on flying in from Los Angeles, before the $412 per stem she was paying for a specific variety of peony that does not grow anywhere near Hawaii and had to be refrigerated and shipped. My parents found out about the flights, or rather, found out there were no flights for them, on a Sunday in early June, 7 weeks before the wedding. My mother called me at 8:52 that night, and I could hear in the first 3 words, "Elena, honey," that something had cracked in her voice that I had not heard since my father's heart attack. She explained, carefully, "The way you explain something you are still trying to convince yourself isn't as bad as it sounds," that Vanessa had called her that afternoon to finalize the room block, and in the course of that call had mentioned, almost as an aside, that my parents' room at the resort had been adjusted because the room block itself had been restructured for cost, and that flights, which my mother had assumed for 4 months were part of what Daniel called taking care of everything, were, according to Vanessa, actually on each guest's own dime. That's just how destination weddings work. It's in the invite language if you read the fine print. There was no fine print. I checked the invitation that night, a physical card my mother had kept in a drawer, and later the digital version too. There was no language anywhere suggesting guests were expected to cover their own airfare to a private island wedding they had been personally, verbally invited to by my brother 11 months earlier, at a family dinner where he had said, "I remember this because I was sitting 6 feet away. Mom, Dad, obviously we're flying you guys out, don't even think about the cost, this is a gift to you." My mother, who had been quietly saving $40 a week from her modest pension income since November specifically for wedding spending money, a fact she told me with the kind of shame that broke something in my chest, did not have 4 flights worth of unplanned money sitting around. Round trip from Dayton to Maui in July, booked 7 weeks out, for 2 people, ran just over $3,100. My mother did not ask me for it. That is important. She would never have asked me for it. She called me because she needed someone to tell her it was going to be okay, and because some small, sensible part of her wanted a second opinion before she called her son and risked, in her words, making things awkward before the wedding. I called Daniel myself the next morning. He was defensive in the specific way he always was when confronted with something he'd rather not think about too hard, which is to say he was immediately, performatively wounded, as though my asking a direct question was itself the aggression. "Elena, it's not that deep. Vanessa's handling the guest logistics. I'll talk to her. Don't make this into a whole thing." I asked him 3 times over the course of that call whether my parents' flights had, in fact, been part of what he originally promised. He did not answer any of the 3 times directly. What he did instead, and I recognize this now as a pattern I had watched my whole life and never named, was pivot to how stressed he was, how much pressure the wedding had put him under, how Vanessa's family had different expectations and he was trying to keep everyone happy. As though my parents' happiness and his fiancé's family's expectations were opposing weather systems he was neutrally caught between, rather than a situation he had personally created by making a promise he never followed through on and never corrected. I did not push further that day. I told myself I would handle the flights myself, quietly, the way I had quietly handled so many things. And I did buy the tickets, that same week, under a fake vendor name on the invoice so my mother would never see the charge and feel guilty about it. What I did not expect, what changed something in me permanently, happened 4 days later. I was on a call with Daniel about an unrelated matter, a document he needed me to review for Marchetti Coastal Ventures, and Vanessa was apparently in the room with him, because partway through the call I heard her voice in the background, not realizing, I believe, that the call was still connected on speaker, or not caring, I was never sure which. She was talking to someone else, a bridesmaid I later identified as a woman named Kayla Ferris, about the flight situation, and I heard her laugh, a real laugh, easy and unbothered, and say the sentence that I have now heard in my head roughly 4,000 times. "If they want to go, they can swim there." Lol, Kayla laughed too. Someone, I never confirmed who, said something about old people and their budget, and Vanessa said, still laughing, "Right? Like, we're not running a charity gala for Danny's parents. They'll figure it out or they won't." Daniel, on the other end of the actual call with me, either did not hear this or heard it and said nothing, and I will never fully know which, because I did not tell him what I'd overheard. I want to be honest that this is the moment the story most people expect me to have exploded, cried, screamed, called my mother in a rage. I did none of those things. What I did was close my laptop, sit very still at my kitchen table for what I later realized was almost 11 minutes, and then open a new folder on my secure drive at work, the kind of folder I create for active investigations, and label it, with the flat procedural language I use for every case, Marchetti Coastal Ventures, Preliminary Review. I texted my mother that night. I told her the flights were handled, a gift from me, framed as something the company had comped for a client thing. A small lie built to protect a larger truth she did not need yet. She thanked me 4 separate times in that text thread, called me her rock, said she didn't know what she'd do without me. I remember reading that message and feeling something very specific. Not warmth, not quite, but its colder cousin, resolve. My mother should never have had to feel grateful for something she was owed. My father should never have had to be a punchline in a bridesmaids group chat about old people and their budget. And Vanessa Cole, who had built an entire identity around being untouchable, effortless, above consequence, had just said something out loud on an open line to a woman who happened to be, professionally, extremely good at finding the exact place where a person's story does not match their numbers. That night, I opened the folder I had started on Marchetti Coastal Ventures and stopped pretending, even to myself, that I was just checking in on Daniel out of concern. I was building a case. I had simply, for the first time in my adult life, stopped deciding in advance that my own family was exempt from the standard I applied to everyone else's. I want to walk you through how a forensic accountant actually builds a case against her own brother, because it is not dramatic the way movies make it look. There is no single smoking gun moment. There is a slow accumulation of small inconsistencies that, individually, mean nothing, and collectively mean everything. I started with what I already had legitimate access to: 3 years of Marchetti Coastal Ventures bank statements from a joint bookkeeping system I had helped Daniel set up in 2021, back when he asked me to just get it organized, and I had, out of sisterly habit, done far more free labor than I should have. I still had read access to that system, technically as a courtesy, never formally revoked. The first thing I did was what I do with every case at Harrow & Vance. I ran a variance analysis, comparing reported revenue against actual deposits, month over month, going back 36 months. What I found in the first 2 weeks was a pattern I recognized immediately, because I had seen it in at least 11 prior cases at my firm. The kind of pattern that gets referred to internally as a round trip, where money moves from a company account to an investor's personal account and then back into the company, disguised as new investment capital, inflating the appearance of investor confidence while actually just recycling the same shrinking pool of cash. In Daniel's case, the round trip involved 3 entities: Marchetti Coastal Ventures itself, a shell LLC called Pacific Bluff Holdings that I eventually traced to an address that turned out to be a UPS store mailbox in Irvine, and a personal account belonging to Marcus Webb. Here is the mechanism as clearly as I can lay it out. Daniel would solicit investment from real people, mostly acquaintances from his social circle, a dentist in Laguna Beach who put in $75,000, a retired couple from his gym who put in $110,000, a former college roommate who put in $40,000. Each promised a specific project, a specific property, specific returns within 18 months. That money would go into the Marchetti Coastal Ventures operating account. From there, roughly 60 to 70% of each new investment would be routed, through Pacific Bluff Holdings, into what the internal memo line described as acquisition costs, or earnest money deposits, but which forensic tracing showed, in every case I could fully document, going instead to pay off prior investors who were asking for their promised returns. To cover Daniel and Marcus's personal expenses, including, I found with a specific, nauseating clarity, $17,000 that went directly toward the deposit on Vanessa's engagement ring, and, most damning of all, to service a growing personal loan Daniel had taken out using an asset I did not expect to find pledged as collateral, a life insurance policy and a small brokerage account belonging to my parents. I need to explain how that happened, because my parents did not knowingly agree to be collateral for their son's failing business, not in any way they understood. In 2022, Daniel had asked my father to co-sign what he described as a small business line of credit, just a formality, my accountant handles everything. And my father, who trusted his son completely and had never in his life read the fine print on anything more complicated than a mortgage, signed a personal guarantee that pledged, as secondary collateral in the event of default, a brokerage account worth roughly $160,000, essentially my parents' entire retirement savings outside of Social Security. Daniel had let the underlying business loan slide into technical default 11 months before the wedding. The lender had not yet moved to collect against my parents' account, but the clock, I confirmed through the loan documents I eventually obtained, was actively running, with a grace period set to expire 4 months after the wedding date. I sat with that fact for 3 days before I told anyone. My brother had, whether through recklessness or willful blindness, put our parents' retirement at direct risk to fund a lifestyle and a wedding for a woman who had just called our father someone who could swim to it if he wanted to attend badly enough. I brought in Rosalind Pierce during the 3rd week of my investigation. Rosalind was 61, a forensic litigation attorney I had worked alongside on 4 prior cases at Harrow & Vance, a woman with a reputation, entirely earned, for being the person opposing counsel dreaded seeing walk into a deposition room. Rosalind did not do sentiment. When I called her, not through work channels but personally, and told her I needed to talk through a family situation that had some fraud-adjacent elements, she listened to the entire outline without interrupting once, and then said the sentence that became the actual turning point of everything that followed. "Elena, I need you to hear me clearly. This isn't a family situation. This is a securities fraud pattern with your parents' retirement account as collateral damage. And if you sit on it because it's your brother, you become a witness who had knowledge and chose silence, which is a very different legal position than the one you're in right now." She agreed to help me, off the clock at first, as a favor, and told me exactly what documentation I would need to build something that could eventually be handed to either the FBI's Financial Crimes Division or, if the interstate wire elements held up the way she suspected they would, directly to the SEC. Over the following 2 months, working almost entirely at night after my regular caseload at Harrow and Vance, I built what Rosalind called, with something close to admiration, an unusually clean file for a case built by a family member. I subpoenaed nothing myself, of course, I had no authority to, but I compiled everything I could access legally. Bank statements Daniel had voluntarily shared with me in prior years for tax purposes and never revoked access to, public LLC filings for Pacific Bluff Holdings, the loan documents bearing my father's signature that I obtained, with his shaking, frightened permission once I finally sat him down and explained, gently, what I'd found, correspondence between Daniel and at least 4 investors that showed him making specific, false representations about property acquisitions that never happened, and financial records showing the flow of funds toward the wedding itself, which Rosalind flagged as particularly useful since fraudulently obtained funds spent on personal luxury expenditures rather than reinvested made the intent element of the fraud significantly easier to establish. The hardest part was not the numbers. The hardest part was my father's face when I sat across from him at their kitchen table in Dayton, in the same house I grew up in, and explained that the small formality he'd signed 3 years earlier had put his and my mother's retirement inside a legal structure that could, within months, be legally seized to cover a business default his own son had allowed to happen, while spending money on a wedding my parents weren't even fully invited to. He did not get angry, not at first. He went very quiet, the particular quiet I remembered from the week after his heart attack, and asked me only one question. "Are you sure?" I told him I was certain, that I had the documents, that I would fix it, that he did not need to do anything except trust me. He nodded, slowly, and then he said something I have not been able to shake since. "I always told your mother you two were opposites. Danny's the one everyone worries about. You're the one we never had to." I understood, sitting there, that this was meant as a compliment, and I understood, at the exact same moment, that it was also the precise mechanism by which our family had allowed one child to accumulate risk without accountability for 37 years, because the other child had spent her whole life absorbing consequences quietly enough that no one ever had to look directly at what she was carrying. While I built the financial case in secret, my visible life did not change at all, and that split, I think, is the part people find hardest to understand when I describe this period. I still showed up to every pre-wedding event. I still smiled. I still let Vanessa touch my forearm and call me future sister, in that warm, performative voice, and I let Patricia introduce me at a bridal luncheon as Danny's sister, she does something with numbers, and I let Brooke ask me, twice more over those 2 months, whether I knew anyone who could get her a sponsorship for her wedding content series. I said yes to all of it. I had learned by then that the version of myself who reacted, who pushed back, who let her face show anything, was far less useful to what I was building than the version who simply watched and recorded. The dress fitting, in late May, was the second time I watched Patricia's entitlement operate at full volume, uninterrupted by any social cost, because no one in that room had ever once told her there would be one. It happened at a boutique in La Jolla, a private appointment that ran 2 hours over its scheduled slot because Patricia insisted on having 4 dresses altered simultaneously for efficiency, despite 3 of them belonging to bridesmaids who were not present and had not approved the specific alterations Patricia was requesting on their behalf. When the boutique's owner, a soft-spoken woman named Grace Nakamura, who had run that shop for 18 years, gently explained that altering a dress without the actual bride-adjacent client present violated their fitting policy, Patricia said, in a tone I will never forget because it was so perfectly, casually cruel, "I don't think you understand who's paying for this, so let's not make this complicated." Grace altered the dresses. I watched Grace's jaw tighten and release, tighten and release, the specific rhythm of a person swallowing something they cannot afford to say out loud, and I recognized it, because it was the same rhythm my own jaw had been running for 2 months straight. The bridal shower, 3 weeks later, hosted at a private clubhouse in Del Mar, with 41 attendees and a professional step-and-repeat backdrop for photos, gave me my second clean look at Brooke's specific brand of opportunism. She had, by then, successfully positioned herself not just as maid of honor, but as the event's unofficial content director, and I watched her spend more time directing a hired photographer toward flattering angles of herself opening gifts alongside Vanessa than she spent actually engaging with the gifts or the guests who'd brought them. At one point, opening an envelope containing a generous check from an elderly great-aunt on the Cole side, Brooke set it down, unopened past a glance at the amount, in order to reshoot a reaction shot for a different, earlier gift that had photographed better. She turned to me at one point during a lull and said, entirely without irony, "Honestly, I think I could build a whole platform just documenting other people's weddings. Like a wedding influencer, but for the guests, that's untapped, right?" I told her it sounded like a genuinely interesting market gap. I meant nothing by it except that I was, by then, incapable of meaning anything I said to anyone in that family except my parents. It was at that same shower that I got my clearest look yet at Vanessa's arrogance operating in a context with real financial stakes, which is what eventually connected her more directly to Loop A than I initially expected. Vanessa, opening a card from my mother that contained, tucked inside, $300 my mother could not comfortably spare, folded carefully into a handwritten note about how excited she was to welcome Vanessa to the family, glanced at the amount, said, quietly enough that she likely thought no one but the guest beside her could hear, "That's sweet, I guess," and set it in a pile with cards containing far larger checks from the Cole side of the family. A pile that, I noticed, she photographed separately for what I correctly guessed would become a curated shower hall post. I did not react. I filed it, the way I filed everything by then, in the growing mental ledger I was keeping alongside the literal financial ledger Rosalind and I were building. The affair, Loop B, the piece I had not gone looking for and did not want to find, revealed itself almost entirely by accident, in the second week of June, 6 weeks before the wedding. I was at Daniel's condo in Newport Beach, there to drop off a folder of documents related to a refinance he'd asked me to review, a request that, in retrospect, he made specifically because he still believed I was simply his helpful, uninformed sister, rather than someone who had, by that point, mapped nearly the entire architecture of his financial life. He wasn't home. Marcus was waiting to hand off a separate set of papers, and while I stood in Daniel's kitchen, Marcus's phone buzzed on the counter, face up, close enough that I saw, without trying to, without wanting to, a text preview from a contact saved as CR Venue, which read, in full view for the 4 seconds before Marcus grabbed it and turned it face down with a laugh that came out half a beat too fast. "Can't stop thinking about last night. Tell D you're checking on floral logistics again. Free lol." I did not say anything. I finished the handoff, left, and sat in my rental car in the parking garage for what I later confirmed, checking my phone's screen time log out of some morbid instinct toward precision, was 19 minutes, doing nothing but staring at the concrete wall in front of me. CR. I already knew from 6 weeks of wedding logistics emails I was copied on as day of family point of contact, was almost certainly Chloe Renner, the wedding coordinator, 26 years old, based in Newport Beach, the woman who had walked my mother through seating chart options with what I had, until that moment, genuinely believed was simple professional warmth. I confirmed it properly 4 days later, through means I am not proud of but do not regret. When I used a legitimate professional login I still had to a records aggregation tool at Harrow and Vance, technically permitted for active client matters, to run a basic flight and hotel pattern check on Marcus Webb's name, the kind of check we run routinely in matrimonial and fraud cases to establish patterns of undisclosed travel. It confirmed 6 separate overnight stays at a boutique hotel in Laguna Beach over 4 months, each one falling on a night Daniel had told my mother, during a call I happened to be on, that Marcus was handling something with the venue in Laguna. Don't worry, he's got it covered. Each one, cross-referenced against Chloe Renner's own public event planning calendar, a calendar she kept openly visible for client bookings, falling on nights she had listed herself as unavailable for personal reasons. I told Rosalind about the affair the same week I confirmed it, not because it was strictly relevant to the fraud case, but because she had asked me, early on, to tell her everything I found, no matter how it seemed to fit, because she said patterns that look unrelated at first often turn out to share a root system. She was quiet for a moment on the phone, then said, "Elena, I want you to think very carefully about whether you want to hold that piece for yourself, or fold it into the larger picture. Financial fraud gets you restitution and possibly prosecution. Personal betrayal, timed correctly, gets you something restitution never will. It gets you a room full of witnesses who can never again pretend they didn't see who these people really are." What I did not tell her, because I had not fully admitted it to myself yet, was that some part of me had already decided, sitting in that parking garage 19 minutes deep in silence, exactly how I wanted this to end, and exactly where. If you've ever had to sit on information like that, calm on the outside while something inside you quietly finishes rearranging itself into a plan, comment the word calm below, because that specific kind of stillness is the only reason any of what happened in Maui was even possible. And if this story has you gripping your phone right now, do me a favor and hit subscribe before the next part, because what Elena found in the final 6 weeks before that wedding is the reason 3 federal agents ended up standing near a raw bar in Maui pretending to be catering staff. I decided in the end to fold everything into a single structure, because Rosalind was right. The 2 betrayals shared a root system, and separating them would have meant giving each one less weight than it deserved. But before I tell you how the wedding day itself unfolded, I need to walk you through the final 6 weeks, because that stretch of time is where Loop B closed first. Quietly, privately, in a conversation that never made it into any headline, and it is where the last pieces of Loop A locked into place. I confronted Chloe Renner directly, alone, 3 weeks before the wedding, not because I owed her anything, but because I needed to understand the shape of what I was dealing with before I decided how to use it. I called her office under the guise of finalizing family seating logistics, and asked her, when we met at a coffee shop in Costa Mesa, whether she had a few minutes to also discuss something unrelated to the wedding. She agreed, visibly unbothered, professionally pleasant, a 26-year-old with a leather portfolio, and a practiced, efficient warmth. I did not raise my voice. I laid a single printed page on the table between us, a redacted summary, hotel and dates only, nothing about Marcus's name yet, and asked her, calmly, whether she recognized the pattern. I watched the color leave her face in real time, watched her hands still on top of the portfolio she'd been holding open a moment earlier. She started to say something about client confidentiality, about how personal matters had no bearing on her professional conduct, and I let her get about 4 sentences into that defense before I said, quietly, "Chloe, I'm not here to ruin your business. I run financial investigations for a living. I know exactly how fast a coordinator's reputation dies in a market this small if it becomes public that she was sleeping with the best man while planning the bride's wedding, on the clock, at the venues she was supposedly there to secure. I'm not threatening you with that. I'm telling you it's true, and I need you to decide, right now, whether you want to be someone who gets exposed alongside the people who used you, or someone who gave a family the truth before it became a spectacle." She was quiet for a long moment, staring at the table, and then she said something I had not expected, something that reframed the entire affair for me in a way that made me almost feel sorry for her. He told me they were basically already over. He said the wedding was mostly for optics, for the families, for Vanessa's mom. He said he was going to tell Daniel everything after, once things settled. I asked her whether she believed that. She looked at me for a long moment and said, "I don't know anymore. I think I stopped asking myself that a while ago." She agreed, in the end, to give me a written statement, time-stamped, with screenshots she still had of specific messages, not out of loyalty to me or to Vanessa, whom she barely knew personally, but, I believe, out of something closer to relief. The particular relief of a person who has been carrying a secret, specifically because carrying it alone had started to feel worse than any consequence of putting it down. She asked, before I left, whether this meant her business was over. I told her honestly that I did not control what happened after the wedding, but that a documented, cooperative statement given voluntarily, before any public exposure, tended in my professional experience to be treated very differently than information dragged out under pressure. I do not know, even now, exactly how her business fared afterward. I know she stopped coordinating events in Orange County within the year. I have chosen not to look further than that. Marcus, I did not confront directly. There was no need. His financial exposure inside Marchetti Coastal Ventures was, by that point, thoroughly documented through the money trail Rosalind and I had built, independent of anything relating to Chloe, And I judged, correctly as it turned out, that the personal betrayal would land with far more force if it surfaced publicly, unrehearsed rather than privately, where he would have weeks to construct a version of events that minimized his role. The last major piece of Loop A fell into place 10 days before the wedding, when Rosalind, working now with a colleague at a firm that specialized in referring matters to federal authorities, walked our full file, financial records, correspondence, the loan documents bearing my father's signature, the pattern of investor fund diversion, to a contact she had at the FBI's Financial Crimes Division in the Los Angeles field office, a supervisory special agent named Denise Whitfield, whom Rosalind had worked with on 2 prior cases. I was not in that meeting. Rosalind called me afterward, her voice carrying an energy I had not heard from her in the entire 2 months I'd known her, something close to excitement, professional excitement, the specific thrill of a person watching a case she believes in start to move under its own institutional weight. They're interested, Elena, genuinely interested. The interstate wire pattern alone gets them jurisdiction, and the investor statements you documented are clean enough to support an active investigation without needing much more from us. Whitfield's team is going to want to move carefully. They're not going to rush an arrest without building their own parallel file, but she asked me one very specific question I need you to think seriously about before you answer. The question, when Rosalind relayed it, was this: did I know, with reasonable confidence, whether Daniel and Marcus would both be in one identifiable, controllable location on a specific date in the near future, a location where federal agents, coordinating quietly with local authorities, could execute what Whitfield's team called a low-profile approach and hold, essentially positioning agents to make contact and, if warranted based on final review, take action, without a chaotic public scene that might allow either man to flee or destroy remaining evidence. I told Rosalind yes. I told her exactly where and exactly when. Rosalind was quiet for a moment on the phone, and then she said, in a tone I had not heard from her before, something closer to genuine concern than professional assessment. Elena, I need to ask you something. As someone who has watched a lot of people go through a lot of ugly family litigation, are you doing this because it's the right, necessary thing to do for your parents and for every other investor Daniel defrauded? Or are you doing it because a room full of witnesses at that specific location gives you something a courthouse never could? I did not answer immediately. I thought about it honestly, standing in my kitchen, the same kitchen where I had first heard Vanessa's laugh through a speakerphone months earlier. Both, I told her finally. It's both, and I'm not going to pretend it isn't. Rosalind was quiet again, and then she said, okay, then let's make sure it's clean enough to survive both reasons. And we spent the next 4 days making sure it was. The 7 days before the wedding moved differently than any week I have lived before or since. A strange, dual-speed time where the surface of my life ran at the normal, mundane pace of packing suitcases and confirming hotel reservations, while underneath, an entirely separate machinery was accelerating toward a fixed point neither Daniel nor Vanessa nor anyone in the Cole family had any idea existed. I flew to Maui 4 days ahead of the wedding, on the same commercial flight as my parents, whose tickets I had bought, whom I had told, truthfully this time, that everything with the flights had been sorted. No further explanation offered, none requested. My mother spent most of the flight showing me photos on her phone of the outfit she'd chosen for the rehearsal dinner. A soft blue dress she'd bought on sale, worried aloud twice that it might be too simple for that family's taste. I told her she looked beautiful, which was true, and I did not tell her that within 72 hours, that family's taste for extravagance was going to be the least significant thing anyone remembered about that week. My father was quieter than usual on that flight, and at one point, somewhere over the Pacific, he leaned toward me and asked, in a voice pitched just under my mother's hearing, the thing with the loan, the collateral thing, is that going to be okay? You said you were handling it? I told him yes, that Rosalind, that a lawyer I work with, was handling it properly, that he would understand everything soon, that I needed him to trust me for a few more days without asking further questions, both for his own protection and because some things were still moving that I could not fully explain yet. He looked at me for a long moment, the specific look of a father recalibrating in real time his understanding of which of his children had actually been the strong one all along, and he nodded and said only, okay, I trust you. And then, after a pause, quieter, you've been carrying a lot, haven't you? For a long time. I did not answer that directly. I told him we'd talk after the wedding. He let it go, but I saw something shift in his face that stayed there for the rest of the trip. a kind of attentiveness toward me that had not existed before, as though he was, for the first time in years, actually looking at his daughter instead of past her toward his son. The resort itself, when we arrived, was the kind of extravagant that makes extravagance start to look like anxiety rather than luxury. An oceanfront property with infinity pools stepped down toward the water, private cabanas already reserved for the Cole family and their inner circle, a welcome dinner the first night that ran, based on a receipt I glimpsed on a table Vanessa's father had left carelessly visible, past $61,000 for 80 guests. I moved through that first night the way I had moved through every event for the past 3 months. Present, pleasant, watching. Vanessa found me by the pool bar around 9, glowing with pre-wedding energy, and hugged me, said, "I'm so glad you're here early, this week is going to be perfect," and I hugged her back and said I was looking forward to it, which, in a sense I did not explain, was true. The rehearsal dinner, 2 nights before the ceremony, was where I had my last extended interaction with Patricia before everything changed, and it gave me one final, almost unnecessary confirmation of her fixed trait, delivered with a precision that, in hindsight, felt almost like the universe tidying up loose ends before the main event. Patricia stood to give a toast, and somewhere in the middle of it, gesturing broadly toward the room, she said, with a warm laugh that clearly did not register its own cruelty, "We are just so thrilled to welcome the Marchetti side of the family, even though, let's be honest, they're going to need a good year or two to get used to how we do things out here." And the room laughed. The specific laugh of people agreeing to find something charming that was, underneath, a small public humiliation of my parents, delivered as a joke at their own son's rehearsal dinner. My mother's smile did not waver, because my mother had spent 66 years perfecting the specific skill of absorbing small public humiliations without letting her face show the cost. I watched my father's jaw tighten exactly once, and then relax, deliberately, the way a man relaxes when he has decided a fight is not worth the toll it will take, or when he has decided, though I did not know this yet, to trust that his daughter is already handling something bigger than the moment in front of him. Brooke, at that same dinner, spent a significant portion of the toasts filming vertical video content for her own account rather than watching her sister's fiancé speak, and afterward asked me, unprompted, whether I thought the swim thing, meaning the joke about my parents that had by then apparently circulated far enough within the wedding party's group chats to become a recurring bit, was too much, or if it was actually kind of iconic, like unhinged bride energy. People love that online. I told her I thought it depended entirely on what happened next. She laughed, missing the specific weight underneath that sentence entirely, and said, "Right? It's giving main character," and walked off to find better lighting for her next video. Rosalind called me that night, late, after everyone had gone to their rooms, to confirm the final logistics. Agent Whitfield's team, working with local Maui County authorities and coordinating quietly under interstate task force provisions, that Rosalind explained to me in more legal detail than I fully absorbed at 11 at night, had confirmed their plan. Agents would be present at the reception venue the following evening, positioned inconspicuously among catering and event staff, with a secondary team stationed nearby, ready to make contact with Daniel and Marcus once specific financial confirmations, still being finalized that day through a parallel warrant process, cleared. Rosalind was careful, precise, almost clinical in how she laid it out, and then, at the end of the call, her voice softened slightly, and she asked me one more time, gently, whether I was certain I wanted to be present for it, whether I wanted to see it happen in person rather than learning about it afterward the way most people in my position would choose to. I told her I had spent 34 years watching consequences land on everyone in my family except the people who most deserved them. I told her I was not interested in reading about this one secondhand. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, in the closest thing to warmth I ever heard from her in the entire time I knew her, "Then get some sleep if you can. Tomorrow's going to be long." I did not sleep, not really, not more than 90 unbroken minutes at a time. I lay in my hotel room listening to the ocean outside, running the timeline in my head over and over, not out of anxiety, exactly, but out of the specific, focused stillness of a person checking, one final time, whether every number in a ledger truly balances before she closes the book. The morning of July 19th arrived the way most mornings before enormous, irreversible days do, deceptively ordinary. The sky over Maui was the specific unbroken blue that shows up in every destination wedding photo ever taken there, and the resort staff moved through their choreography of chairs and flowers and lighting checks, with the practiced calm of people who had done this 100 times before and had no idea this particular ceremony would be different from every one of them. I got ready alongside my mother in her room, helping with the clasp on a necklace my father had bought her 39 years earlier, an anniversary gift neither of them could really have afforded at the time. She kept saying, throughout the morning, how happy she was, how she couldn't believe her baby boy was getting married, and every time she said it, I felt the specific vertigo of holding two entirely separate versions of the same day in my head at once. The one she believed she was living, and the one I knew was actually coming. The ceremony itself took place at 5:30 in the evening on a bluff overlooking the water. 206 guests seated in white chairs facing an arch built from the $412 a stem peonies Vanessa had insisted on. Daniel stood at the altar in a tuxedo that fit him the way expensive things fit people who have never once had to think about what they cost. And when Vanessa walked down the aisle on her father's arm, the room made the specific collective sound rooms make when they agree, unanimously, that someone looks beautiful. I sat in the second row on the Marchetti side, between my father and an aunt visiting from Ohio, and I watched my brother's face as his bride approached him. Watched him look at her, the way you look at someone you have built your entire understanding of your own worth around, and for one brief, complicated moment, I felt something that surprised me. Not doubt, exactly, but a kind of grief, for the version of this day that could have existed if either of them had simply been honest, at any point, about anything. The ceremony itself passed without incident. Vows were exchanged. Vanessa cried, real tears, and I believe, even now, that some part of what she felt in that moment was genuine, which is one of the more uncomfortable truths I have had to sit with since. That people can be capable of real love and real cruelty within the same 24 hours, sometimes within the same hour. They were pronounced married. The room applauded. I applauded too because there was still work ahead that required me looking, for a few more hours, exactly like everyone else in that crowd. The reception moved to a lower terrace as the sun began to set. An open-air space strung with lights and lined with a raw bar and a 17-piece ensemble that struck up the moment the wedding party was announced. I want to describe, carefully, the staff moving through that reception, because at the time, no one but Rosalind, Agent Whitfield's team, and I knew that 4 of the 11 catering staff working the raw bar and the perimeter of the dance floor were not, in fact, employees of the resort's catering company, but federal agents in borrowed uniforms positioned there over the preceding 6 hours through arrangements Rosalind had made with the resort's general manager, who had been read in, under strict confidentiality, earlier that day once the warrant paperwork cleared. Dinner was served, toasts were given, Marcus's among them, delivered with the easy, practiced charm I had watched him deploy at a dozen prior events. A toast that included the line, delivered with a grin toward Daniel, "This guy taught me everything I know about vision, about seeing an opportunity before anyone else does." A sentence that would, within the hour, take on a meaning at that reception that Marcus could not have anticipated. I sat through all of it, smiling when smiling was expected, clapping when clapping was expected, feeling the specific electric stillness of a person standing at the very edge of something about to become irreversible. It happened during the father-daughter dance, or rather, immediately after it, in the transitional lull before the general dance floor opened, the moment Rosalind and I had identified weeks earlier. Through careful review of the wedding timeline Vanessa's own planner had circulated to vendors, as the point of maximum guest attention with minimum active ceremony to interrupt. I watched Agent Whitfield, dressed in a caterer's black button-down, catch my eye across the terrace, a single, small nod, and I felt my pulse do something I can only describe as settling, the specific calm that comes not from the absence of fear, but from having already made every decision that matters. I stood, and I walked to the small stage where the band leader stood waiting for his next cue, and I asked him, quietly, for the microphone, explaining that I had a brief toast I wanted to give, one the couple had specifically asked family to keep as a surprise. This was, I want to be honest, the only outright lie I told that entire evening, and I told it without hesitation, because I judged, correctly, that no one on that stage was going to interrupt the sister of the groom mid-request at a wedding that prided itself on appearing flawless. I want to tell you exactly what I said because I have replayed it enough times to recite it precisely. I raised the microphone, waited for the terrace to quiet, the specific expectant hush of 200 people assuming they are about to hear something sentimental, and I said, "Thank you all for being here tonight to celebrate Daniel and Vanessa." I want to start with something Vanessa said to my mother a few months ago, when we were sorting out travel arrangements for this beautiful day. She said, and I'm quoting this exactly, "If they want to go, they can swim there." I found that funny too, actually, because it turns out my parents weren't the only ones who were going to have trouble getting the resources they were promised. The laugh that had started in the crowd, the automatic, half-second laugh of people expecting a light roast, died in real time, replaced by the specific confused silence of an audience realizing, before they can articulate why, that something has shifted. I kept going, my voice level, the same voice I use presenting findings in a boardroom, because that is, in every meaningful sense, what I was doing. For the past 4 months, I've been working with an attorney and, more recently, with federal investigators on a financial fraud matter involving Marchetti Coastal Ventures, the company my brother built with his business partner and best man, Marcus Webb, standing right there. That company took investment money from at least 7 people in this room tonight, promised specific returns on specific properties, and instead used the majority of those funds to cover personal expenses, prior investor payouts, and, as it happens, a significant portion of tonight's wedding, including the flowers over that arch, which cost $412 a stem, paid for partly with money that was supposed to buy a retired couple from Daniel's own gym a down payment on their retirement home. Daniel was on his feet by then, saying my name, saying, "Elena, what are you doing?" His face draining of color in a way I had genuinely never seen before, not even during his lowest moments growing up. I did not stop. I also want to mention, because I think everyone deserves complete information tonight, that Marcus has spent the last several months in a relationship with Chloe, your wedding coordinator, Vanessa, including 6 overnight stays I can document at a hotel in Laguna Beach. Several of them on nights he told my mother he was, quote, handling logistics at the venue. Vanessa's face, I will remember for the rest of my life, went through 3 distinct expressions in under 4 seconds: confusion, disbelief, and then, as her eyes moved to Marcus, who had gone completely still, a horror that had nothing at all to do with anything I had said about money. That was the moment Agent Whitfield moved. She crossed the terrace calmly, flanked by 2 other agents who had shed their catering aprons, badges now visible, and approached Daniel and Marcus directly, her voice carrying, clear and procedural, across a terrace that had gone almost completely silent except for the ocean below. Daniel Marchetti, Marcus Webb, I'm Special Agent Denise Whitfield with the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. We have some questions for both of you regarding Marchetti Coastal Ventures, and we're going to need you to come with us. She did not handcuff them there, not in front of 200 guests. That detail matters, because the process was procedural and careful, not theatrical. Agents explaining quietly that this was an initial contact connected to an active investigation, that formal charges, if they came, would follow proper process, but the effect on that terrace required no handcuffs to land with full force. I watched my brother's best man's tan face go the color of the tablecloths. I watched Daniel's mouth open and close twice without producing a sound. Vanessa turned to me, and for one raw, unguarded second, before the performance instinct could reassemble itself, I saw something in her face that I think was almost gratitude, mixed with a devastation so total it briefly erased everything performative about her, and she said quietly, just to me, "Did you know about Chloe before tonight?" I told her the truth. For about 6 weeks. She did not say anything else to me that night. I do not know, even now, whether the thing I felt watching her face collapse was satisfaction or something closer to sorrow, for a person who had built her entire self on foundations exactly as unstable as the ones I'd spent months tracing through my own family. Patricia, to her credit, or perhaps simply to her nature, did not comfort her daughter first. She turned to me, in front of everyone, and said, in the same voice she'd used on Grace Nakamura, the seamstress, 2 months earlier, "Do you have any idea what you've just done to this family's reputation?" I looked at her, and I said the only thing I had left to say to Patricia Cole after 11 months of watching her treat other people as scenery in her own life. "I know exactly what I've done, Patricia. I've done to your family what your daughter tried to do to mine, when she decided my parents didn't matter enough to fly to their own son's wedding." I set the microphone down on the nearest table, and I walked back to where my parents were sitting, both of them frozen, my mother's hand pressed flat against her chest, my father already rising to meet me halfway across the terrace, and I let my father put his arms around me for the first time since his heart attack, and I finally let myself cry. Not from grief, but from the sheer released weight of 4 months spent holding something enormous, perfectly, completely still. I want to describe what happened in the hour immediately after the agents led Daniel and Marcus away, because the wedding did not simply end, the way you might imagine, with a clean, cinematic cut to black. 206 guests do not disperse instantly. They stood, clustered in disbelieving knots across that terrace, some already on their phones, several visibly recording, a fact I registered with a distant, exhausted awareness that within hours this would not stay contained to the people present. It would move, the way everything moves now, into a wider current I had no ability to control and, if I am honest, no real desire to. Kayla Ferris, the bridesmaid who had laughed at Vanessa's original comment about my parents swimming to Hawaii, approached me at one point, her face pale, and said, in a voice stripped of all its earlier ease, "I didn't know about any of that." About the money, I swear I didn't know. I told her I believed her, which I did, mostly, and that belief did not particularly matter to me one way or another by that point. Several of the defrauded investors, three of whom I recognized from documents I'd spent months reviewing, found me over the following half hour, one by one, the dentist from Laguna Beach, the retired couple from Daniel's gym, faces I had only ever seen in bank statements and wire confirmations, now standing in front of me in wedding attire, asking questions I answered as honestly and completely as I could, given what I was legally able to share. The retired husband, a man named Harold Pruitt, gripped my hand at one point and said, "We put our whole down payment into that deal. We didn't know how to even start looking into it. Thank you for looking." I did not feel triumphant hearing that. I felt something heavier, something closer to the specific tiredness of finally setting down a weight I had been the only one carrying. My mother did not speak much that first hour. She sat with my father's arm around her, staring at the water, and at one point she took my hand and said quietly, "How long, Elena? How long have you been carrying all of this by yourself?" I told her the truth. 4 months on the financial piece, 6 weeks on the affair, and I watched her absorb that math, watched her recalculate, in real time, every phone call over that period where I had told her things were handled or fine, understanding now what those words had actually been covering. She did not say anything for a long moment, and then she said something that undid me more than anything Vanessa or Patricia had said all night. "I'm so sorry we let you become the person who has to fix everything. That was never supposed to be your job. It was supposed to be all of ours." I told her it was okay. She said, firmly, in a tone I had rarely heard from her, "No, it's not okay, but it's going to change." Vanessa's father, Gerald, largely absent from the earlier drama, having spent most of the evening in quiet, agitated phone calls of his own once the agents left, approached me near the end of that first chaotic hour, and I want to include this because it surprised me. He did not defend his daughter or his wife. He said in a low voice, "I've had a bad feeling about Marcus's involvement in Danny's company for a while now. I should have said something. I didn't want to be the difficult father-in-law." I told him it wasn't too late to say something now, and gave him Rosalind's contact information, which he took, and which, I later learned, he actually used, providing a statement 3 weeks later that corroborated part of the timeline regarding Marcus's diverted funds, a detail that ended up mattering more than either of us understood that night. Rosalind found me around 11, having coordinated by phone with Agent Whitfield's team from a quiet corner of the resort lobby for most of the intervening hour, and gave me the practical update I needed. Daniel and Marcus had been taken in for questioning, not yet formally arrested in the sense of being booked. Since the investigation, though far along, required additional procedural steps before formal charges could be filed, but both men were now, unambiguously, the named subjects of an active federal financial crimes investigation, with additional state-level fraud referrals likely given the scope of investor losses. "This doesn't end tonight," she told me, with the flat honesty I had come to rely on from her. "This is the beginning of a process that's going to take months, possibly over a year, before anything resolves in court. But the evidence is strong, Elena. Genuinely strong. Whatever happens from here, you built something real." I asked her what would happen to the wedding. Meaning, absurdly, in that surreal, exhausted moment, the marriage itself. And she looked at me and said, gently, "That part isn't really evidence-based. That part's just going to be whatever they decide to make of it." I flew home 4 days later with my parents, on a flight that felt entirely different from the one that had carried us out. Quieter, but not in the way of grief, in the way of something having finally, properly settled. My father held my hand for most of the descent into Dayton, something he had not done since I was perhaps 9 years old, and said, as the wheels touched down, "I don't think I ever really understood what you do for a living. Not really, not until this week." I told him it was okay, most people didn't, that discretion was sort of the whole job. He shook his head. No, I mean, I didn't understand what it costs you to be the one who sees everything and has to decide what to do with it. I did not have a good answer for that. I still don't, entirely. What I had, instead, over the months that followed, was the slow, uneven process of watching what happens to a family, and to the people who married into and around it, once the truth finally, fully, becomes public. 11 months have passed since that terrace in Maui, and I think the honest way to tell you what happened to everyone involved is to walk through it person by person, the way I once walked through their finances. Because in the end, the two kinds of accounting turned out to be more related than I ever expected. Daniel pleaded guilty in April to 2 counts of wire fraud as part of a negotiated agreement that avoided a full trial in exchange for cooperation against Marcus, whose role, once federal investigators fully mapped the fund diversions, turned out to be significantly larger than even I had documented, including a separate, earlier scheme involving a different, smaller group of investors 2 years before Vanessa entered the picture. One Marcus had run essentially alone, using Daniel's name and charisma as cover without Daniel's full knowledge, a detail that complicated my own feelings about my brother's culpability more than I expected it to. Daniel was sentenced in June to 18 months in a federal facility, along with a restitution order requiring him to repay, over time, the full amount defrauded from investors, an amount that, once forensic accountants working for the prosecution finished their own independent tally, came to just over $1,100,000 across all victims, more than I had even fully mapped myself. He is currently 7 months into that sentence. I have visited him twice. The second visit, 3 months ago, was the first time since childhood that I saw my brother cry in front of me without an audience to perform for, and he said, among other things, that he understood now why I had done what I did, that some small, ashamed part of him had known, on some level for years, that the version of himself he'd built was hollow, and that he had simply never had a reason strong enough to stop building it until the entire structure collapsed publicly in front of everyone he'd tried to impress. I do not know yet what our relationship will look like when he's released. I know it will not look like it did before, and I have made a kind of peace with that. Marcus received a harsher sentence, 32 months, reflecting both the scope of his separate scheme and what the sentencing judge described. In language I read later in the court transcript Rosalind sent me, as a demonstrated pattern of attaching himself to others' credibility while avoiding proportional accountability for his own conduct. A description that struck me as almost uncannily precise, an entire personality summarized in one paragraph of federal sentencing language. Chloe Renner was never criminally implicated, her conduct having involved no financial fraud, only the affair itself, but her business, as I'd predicted, did not survive the exposure. She relocated to Denver the following spring, according to a mutual contact, and has, as far as I know, left event planning entirely, now working, of all things, in a bank's compliance department, a career pivot I found almost too fitting to be real when I first heard about it. Vanessa filed for an annulment 9 weeks after the wedding, on grounds of fraud, a legal irony that Rosalind pointed out to me with something close to dark amusement, given that the annulment filing essentially confirmed, in a separate legal proceeding, everything I had said publicly on that terrace. The marriage was formally dissolved by December. Vanessa's public presence, once built around effortless glamour and 41,000 followers who treated her life as aspirational content, cratered almost immediately after the wedding footage, filmed by at least 6 different guests, made its way online within days, edited into versions with titles I will not dignify by repeating, viewed, at last count I saw referenced in an unrelated article, somewhere north of 30 million times across platforms. She lost roughly 2/3 of her following within a month. The last information I have about her, filtered secondhand through Gerald, who has remained, cautiously, in occasional contact with my mother, is that she has moved back into her parents' house in Rancho Santa Fe and has not returned to any form of public content creation. Patricia Cole's specific downfall was, in some ways, the most satisfying to witness secondhand, though I want to be honest that satisfaction is a complicated, not entirely comfortable feeling to sit with in relation to another person's life falling apart. 3 of the 6 charity boards she sat on quietly declined to renew her seat at their next annual meetings. Board members citing, according to Gerald, discomfort with the family's association with an active federal fraud case, and, separately, discomfort with video footage of Patricia's earlier toast about the Marchetti family needing a year or 2 to get used to how we do things, which had circulated online attached to the wedding footage and painted her, accurately, as someone whose cruelty had been casual, habitual, and entirely undisguised the moment a camera happened to catch it. She has not, to my knowledge, hosted an event at the Rancho Santa Fe house since. Brooke's wedding influencer for guests platform, which she had in fact begun building in the weeks before the wedding, collapsed before it ever properly launched. Her own footage from that reception, capturing her filming reaction shots instead of comforting her sister in the immediate aftermath, becoming one of the more widely mocked pieces of the viral footage. Her divorce proceedings, already strained by the frozen assets I'd noted a year earlier, finalized in a settlement significantly less favorable to her than her attorneys had originally projected. A fact I learned not through any investigation of my own, but through an unrelated professional acquaintance who happened to work adjacent to the case. My parents' retirement account was fully protected in the end. Rosalind helped my father file the necessary documentation to have the personal guarantee voided on grounds that it had been obtained through what her filing described as materially misleading representations about the underlying loan's purpose and risk. A filing that succeeded largely because Daniel's own guilty plea and cooperation agreement corroborated the fraud pattern independently. My father cried when Rosalind called to confirm the account was fully released from any claim, the second time in less than a year I had seen him cry, and both times, I realized only in retrospect, had been about money. Not because he cared about money for its own sake, but because money, in our family, had always quietly stood in for something else. For whether the people who loved you had actually protected you, or merely told you they had. As for me, I want to be careful about how I describe what happened to my own life over these 11 months, because I do not want to frame it as a triumphant rise built on other people's ruin, even though, mechanically, some of that is exactly what it was. Heroin Vance made me a full partner in February, the youngest in the firm's history, a promotion that had already been under quiet internal discussion before the wedding, but that accelerated significantly once senior partners became aware, through channels I never fully traced, of the scope and precision of the investigation I had built essentially in my spare time, unpaid, against my own family. I now lead a small team, 4 investigators, on cases that involve exactly the kind of pattern I first learned to recognize in my own brother's bank statements. My parents moved 6 months ago into a smaller, single-story house 11 minutes from my own new place in Chicago, a move I helped fund and one my father, for the first time in his life, let me help with, without protest, without insisting he could handle it himself. I think about, more than I expected to, the sentence my father said to me at their kitchen table the week I first showed him the loan documents. "Danny's the one everyone worries about. You're the one we never had to." I understand now that this sentence, meant with love, was also a kind of quiet instruction I absorbed for 34 years, one that taught me my own needs were less urgent than everyone else's, that my role was to be reliable rather than seen, useful rather than protected. I do not fully blame my parents for that instruction. I understand, now, watching them in their smaller house, slower to assume the best about everyone, more careful with what they hand each other, that they are unlearning it too, in their own way, at 68 and 66, which is a harder thing to do at that age than most people acknowledge. So here's the question I actually want to leave you with, because I think it matters more than anything that happened on that terrace in Maui. If you are the person in your family who quietly absorbs everyone else's chaos so the surface stays calm, the one everyone else assumes can handle anything because you have never once let them see what handling it costs you, at what point does being trusted with everything become indistinguishable from being protected by no one? And how long are you willing to wait to find out? I want to go back before I close this out and tell you about a few things I skipped over in the interest of pace, because they matter. And because I think the full weight of what happened only lands if you understand the smaller, quieter moments that surrounded the big, loud ones. There was a night in early July, 12 days before the wedding, when I almost stopped everything. I want to be honest about that, because it would be dishonest to present myself as someone who moved through those 4 months with unwavering certainty. I was at my apartment in Chicago, reviewing the final compiled file with Rosalind over video call, when my phone buzzed with a text from Daniel. Unprompted, unrelated to anything I was doing, just a photo of the two of us as kids, maybe 7 and 9, standing in front of our childhood house with our father's old Buick in the background, both of us missing the same front tooth because we'd knocked it out on the same swing set 2 years apart. The caption said only, "Found this going through mom's old albums. Miss being a kid with you, love you sis." I sat with that message for almost an hour, the file still open on my second monitor. Rosalind's face frozen on a paused call I'd muted, while I tried to figure out what I was feeling. I remember thinking, with a clarity that scared me a little, that it would be so easy right then to close the folder, to tell Rosalind I'd changed my mind, to let my parents keep believing everything was fine, to let Daniel keep being the golden child a little longer, to protect the fragile piece of a family that had functioned, however imperfectly, for 34 years, by simply not looking too closely at anything. I called my mother instead, not to tell her anything, just to hear her voice. And we talked for 20 minutes about nothing. About a neighbor's new fence, about a recipe she'd tried, and somewhere in the middle of that ordinary conversation, she mentioned, entirely in passing, that she'd finally stopped setting aside her $40 a week for wedding spending money because she'd realized, doing the math herself, that even with the money saved, she still wouldn't be able to afford a nice enough gift to match what she assumed the Cole family would expect. And she'd decided to just get Vanessa something small and heartfelt instead. I'm sure that'll be enough. The quiet, practiced smallness in her voice when she said, I'm sure that'll be enough, a woman who had worked 26 years at a front desk, apologizing in advance for not having more to give to a family that had spent $61,000 on a single welcome dinner, was the thing that actually steadied me that night, more than any spreadsheet or legal strategy. I got back on the call with Rosalind 20 minutes later and told her I was ready to finish what we'd started. She never knew, until I told her much later, how close that particular night had come to changing everything. I also want to tell you about Harold and Susan Pruitt, the retired couple from Daniel's gym who had put $110,000, nearly their entire liquid savings, into what they believed was a specific duplex acquisition in Huntington Beach. I met with them twice during the investigation, once early on, when Rosalind and I needed to confirm details of their original investment documents, and once after, in September, several weeks after the wedding, at their small house in Fountain Valley, to walk them through the restitution process now underway through the federal case. Susan, 71, had worked as a school librarian for 38 years. Harold, 73, had spent his career as an electrician. They had trusted Daniel specifically because he'd spent 8 months at their gym remembering their names, asking about their grandchildren, making them feel, in a way that I understood intimately by then, like exactly the kind of people worth investing real warmth in. Susan told me, sitting at their kitchen table with a plate of store-bought cookies she'd insisted on setting out despite my protests, that the hardest part wasn't the money, though the money was terrifying. It was feeling stupid, at our age, for believing someone who seemed so genuinely kind. I told her what I have come to believe is the truest thing I learned through this entire process, that con artists are rarely good at lying convincingly. What they are actually good at is being warm convincingly, warm enough that the lying becomes almost incidental, easy to overlook, because who wants to interrogate someone who makes you feel that good about yourself? Susan cried when I said that. So did I, a little, which surprised me, because by September I thought I had cried everything out that I had in me. I want to tell you, too, about the specific moment I finally understood something about Vanessa that complicated my feelings toward her permanently, something I have never said publicly before this. 6 weeks after the wedding, once the initial explosion of public attention had started to fade into the slower, grinding reality of legal proceedings, Vanessa reached out to me directly, through a mutual contact, asking if I would be willing to meet, just once. No lawyers, no recording, just the two of us. I almost said no. Rosalind advised strongly against it, but something in me wanted to understand, so I agreed, and we met at a quiet coffee shop in Del Mar, both of us wearing sunglasses indoors like a bad movie about scandal, both of us aware of how absurd that was, and neither of us laughing about it. She did not apologize for the comment about my parents swimming to Hawaii, not directly, not in so many words, but she said something adjacent to an apology that I have thought about often since. I grew up being told constantly that I was the prize, that anyone who got to be near our family was lucky, that generosity toward people outside our circle was optional, a nice to have, not an obligation. I didn't think of what I said about your parents as cruel. I genuinely didn't. I thought of it as, I don't know, just how things worked. I know how that sounds now. I asked her whether she regretted saying it. She was quiet for a long moment, turning her coffee cup slowly on the table, and said, I regret that it was recorded. I'm not sure yet if I regret having thought it in the first place, and I hate that about myself, but I'd rather tell you the truth than perform remorse I'm not sure I fully feel yet. I respected that answer more than I expected to. It was the only completely honest thing anyone in the Cole family said to me in the entire 11 months that followed. We did not become friends. We have not spoken since. But I think about that conversation more than almost any other from that whole period, because it taught me something about the difference between people who perform accountability and people who are actually, slowly, uncomfortably capable of it. And Vanessa, whatever else she was, turned out to belong, at least partially, to the second category, which is more than I can say for her mother. I should also tell you about the period between the wedding and Daniel's sentencing, roughly 9 months, because it was not the clean, linear unraveling that news coverage of the case made it look like from the outside. There were 3 separate court appearances I attended in Los Angeles federal court, each one a strange, sterile contrast to the chaos of that Maui terrace. All fluorescent lighting and careful procedural language, attorneys speaking in the specific flattened cadence of people who have said the same categories of sentences 1,000 times before. I sat in the gallery for all 3, sometimes beside my parents, sometimes alone, watching my brother in a suit that no longer fit him quite the way his old ones had, having lost, I noticed with a specific ache, close to 15 pounds in the months since the wedding. His charisma, so reliable for 37 years, visibly draining out of him in real time under the weight of a system that did not care how likable he was. The second hearing, in October, was the one where the government formally presented its full accounting of investor losses, a presentation delivered by an assistant U.S. attorney named Priya Nair, using, I noticed with a strange, detached professional pride, several of the same forensic tracing methodologies I had used in my own preliminary file, methodologies the FBI's forensic team had independently verified and, in 2 instances, extended further than I had managed on my own. Priya Nair read the final tally into the record. $1,112,400 in documented investor losses across 9 victims, not 7. 2 additional victims having come forward after the case became public. People who had invested with Daniel years earlier, before Vanessa, before I had any visibility into his finances at all, whose losses I had never even known to look for. One of those additional victims, a man named Frank Delgado, approached me in the hallway outside the courtroom after that hearing, introducing himself, thanking me, and then telling me something that stayed with me for weeks afterward. He had invested $18,000 with Daniel back in 2019, lost it within a year, and had simply absorbed the loss quietly, embarrassed, assuming it was his own fault for trusting a young, charming guy he'd met at a gym, never reporting it anywhere, never telling his wife the full amount, carrying that shame alone for 5 years until he saw the news coverage of the wedding and realized he had not, in fact, simply been unlucky or foolish. He had been the earliest documented instance of a pattern that would eventually cost 8 other people, combined, over $1 million. I thought it was just me, he told me, standing in that hallway. For 5 years, I thought it was just me being stupid. I told him what I had started telling everyone who said some version of that sentence to me by then, that shame is one of fraud's most effective and least discussed tools, because a person who believes their loss is a private embarrassment rather than part of a documented pattern rarely reports it, rarely compares notes with anyone, and that isolation is not an accident. It is, whether the fraudster consciously understands this or not, part of what allows the pattern to continue undetected for years. I want to tell you about Rosalind too, because our relationship changed significantly over those months, evolving from a professional favor into something closer to mentorship, and eventually something closer to friendship, though Rosalind would likely object to that word as insufficiently precise. She took me to lunch the week after my partnership was announced at Harrow and Vance, at a quiet restaurant near the firm's Chicago office, and told me, over a meal she insisted on paying for despite my protests, something I had not expected from her. I've watched a lot of people build cases against people they love, Elena. Most of them fall into one of 2 categories. The first category burns out completely afterward, can't do this work anymore, the emotional cost is too high once they realize what it actually feels like to see it through. The second category gets cold, permanently, treats every relationship afterward like a potential case file, trusts no one fully again. You did something I don't see very often. You stayed soft where it mattered, with your parents, with those investors, even I think with Vanessa in that coffee shop you told me about against my explicit advice, and you stayed precise everywhere else. That's rarer than talent. That's judgment, and judgment is the only thing I actually can't teach anyone. I did not know what to say to that. I still think about it more than almost anything else anyone said to me during that entire period. I started seeing a therapist in September, 3 months after the wedding, something I had never done before, having spent most of my adult life believing, with the specific stubbornness of someone who has always been told she's the strong one, that therapy was for people whose lives had actually fallen apart, not for people who had simply, competently handled things. My therapist, a calm, unhurried woman named Dr. Aaliyah Reyes, spent most of our early sessions asking me a version of the same question in different forms. When, specifically, in my life, had I decided that being needed was the same thing as being loved? And what would it cost me to separate those two things now? I did not have a good answer in September. I am not sure I have a complete answer even now, 11 months later. But I have started, slowly, to notice the difference in real time, in small moments, like the first time my mother asked how I was doing, genuinely, at length, before asking me to help her with anything, a shift that happened gradually over the months after the wedding. Once she understood, finally, what her habit of leaning on me without checking in on me had actually cost. I also began, around February, seeing someone romantically for the first time in almost 2 years, a structural engineer named James Okafor. I met through a mutual friend at Harrow and Vance, someone entirely outside my professional world, who knew nothing about forensic accounting and, more importantly, nothing about my family, at least not until I told him myself, slowly, over several months, watching his face carefully each time for the specific look I had started to dread, the mixture of fascination and faint alarm that made me feel, for months after the wedding became public, like a story before I was a person. James did not give me that look. When I finally told him the full version, sitting on his apartment balcony on a night in April, he was quiet for a while, and then he said, "I keep trying to imagine what it would take for me to do what you did, for my own family, and I genuinely don't know if I have it in me. I don't say that as a compliment exactly. I say it because I think it might have cost you something most people never have to pay, and I don't want to pretend that's simple." That was, I think, the first time since the wedding that anyone had responded to what I did without either lionizing it or flinching from it, and it made me trust him faster than I trust most people. I want to describe one more scene before I get to where things stand today, because I think it captures something the rest of this story hasn't quite managed to, which is what accountability actually looks like once the cameras and the courtroom lighting are gone, in the slow, unglamorous work of a family trying to rebuild something honest out of what used to be a performance of closeness. My parents and I started family therapy in November, 5 months after the wedding, at Dr. Reyes's suggestion. Initially just the three of us, since Daniel was, by then, already navigating his own legal proceedings and not available for joint sessions in any meaningful sense. The first session was, frankly, brutal. My mother cried for most of the first 40 minutes, apologizing repeatedly for a pattern she said she could now see clearly, but had never once questioned while it was happening. The pattern of treating my competence as permission to stop worrying about me, treating Daniel's charm as a reason to worry about him constantly, and never once asking either of us whether that division actually reflected what we needed, rather than what was simply convenient for the whole family's emotional bandwidth. My father, who has never been a particularly verbal man, said less, but toward the end of that first session, he said something that the therapist later told me was one of the more direct pieces of self-awareness she'd witnessed in a first family session in her career. "I think I loved you both the same amount, Elena. I really do believe that. But I think I only ever worried about one of you, and worrying, when you're a parent, ends up looking an awful lot like where you actually put your attention. And now I understand attention was its own kind of gift I wasn't giving you, even when I loved you just as much." We have had, at this point, 14 family sessions, sometimes just the three of us, twice with Daniel joining by video call from the facility where he's serving his sentence, which the facility permits under specific supervised conditions for approved family therapeutic contact. Those 2 sessions with Daniel were the hardest of the 14, both of us stripped of every performance we'd relied on for 30 years. Him without the charm that had always smoothed over hard conversations. Me without the competent, unbothered exterior I'd used to avoid ever admitting how much any of this had cost me. In the second of those 2 sessions, in May, Daniel said something that I have chosen to believe, though I recognize belief itself is a choice I am actively making rather than a certainty I have earned yet. "I used to think you doing everything for everyone was just who you were, like it cost you nothing because you never complained. I understand now that not complaining and it costing nothing were never the same thing, and I think some part of me needed to believe they were the same thing, because it let me keep taking without ever having to feel bad about it. I do not know yet, 11 months out, whether my brother and I will fully repair what broke between us, or whether some parts of a relationship, once you've had to build a federal case against the person on the other end of it, simply exist differently forever. Smaller in some ways, more honest in others. I have chosen, for now, to keep showing up to the sessions, to keep answering his letters, to keep believing that people, even people who have caused real harm, are not always permanently identical to the worst thing they've done, provided the accountability that follows is real rather than performed. The restitution payments began in earnest in the spring, structured through the court as a percentage of Daniel's future earnings once he's released, plus liquidation of remaining assets, which was not much, it turned out, once the true scope of the spending was untangled, most of what had once looked like wealth having been, as I'd suspected for years, mostly leverage and appearance rather than actual equity. Harold and Susan Pruitt received their first restitution payment in March, $11,000, a fraction of what they'd lost, with more scheduled over the coming years as Daniel's post-release earnings allow. Susan called me the day it arrived, crying, not from relief exactly, she told me, but from the specific validation of watching a system actually, finally, slowly work the way it's supposed to. After 5 years of nobody believing Frank Delgado and 18 months of her and Harold wondering whether their own retirement savings were simply gone for good. Frank Delgado's original $18,000 loss, the earliest documented instance in the whole pattern, was included in the final restitution order as well, 5 years after the fact. A small, quiet correction to a wound he'd carried alone for half a decade, believing it was only ever his own foolishness. I want to tell you, too, about how my work changed, because I think it matters beyond just the personal reckoning. Harrow and Vance created, in January, a new practice group specifically focused on what the firm's other partners started calling, somewhat to my discomfort, family-adjacent fraud patterns, essentially formalizing a category of case, investors defrauded by people they trusted specifically because of personal or social proximity, rather than professional credentials, that had always existed but had never been treated as a distinct specialty before. I lead that group now. We have taken on 11 cases since January, none of them involving my own family again, obviously, but all of them following recognizable shapes: a charismatic relative or family friend, investors who trusted the personal relationship more than they verified the financial claims, a pattern of shame and isolation that kept victims from comparing notes with each other for months or years. In 3 of those 11 cases, our investigations have already led to referrals that resulted in active law enforcement involvement, and in one, concluded just last month, a woman in Seattle recovered nearly the full amount her uncle had defrauded from her and 4 of her friends, a genuinely rare outcome in fraud cases generally, made possible largely because she came forward early enough, before the money had been fully dissipated. Something I now spend a significant portion of my public-facing work, occasional interviews, a handful of speaking engagements at financial literacy nonprofits, actively encouraging people to do: report early, report even when it's a relative, especially when it's a relative, because the emotional cost of staying silent almost never turns out to be smaller than the cost of speaking up. It just gets paid later, in smaller installments, for longer. There is a strange, specific weirdness to watching a private catastrophe become public entertainment, and I want to spend some time on that, because it is a part of this story that no amount of forensic accounting prepared me for. Within 3 days of the wedding, the footage, filmed by at least 6 different guests from 6 different angles, had been stitched together, captioned, and reposted across platforms I barely use, viewed, by the count I mentioned earlier, somewhere north of 30 million times. The phrase, "if they want to go, they can swim there," became for a period of roughly 6 weeks a genuine meme, appearing as a caption under unrelated videos about entitled behavior, stitched into audio clips, referenced in comment sections on posts that had nothing to do with my family at all. I remember the first time I saw a stranger, someone with no connection to any of us, use the phrase unironically in a comment about a completely different situation, an entitled coworker story, and feeling a specific vertigo, the sense of watching something that had cost my family real, private pain get flattened into a punchline for people who would never know my father's actual face, the specific way it had gone still and quiet at that kitchen table in Dayton. I received, in the weeks following the wedding, more media requests than I could reasonably count, producers for at least 4 different television programs, journalists from 3 national outlets, 2 documentary production companies, and a literary agent who reached out twice suggesting I write the full story for what she described, with an enthusiasm that made me faintly uncomfortable, as a guaranteed bestseller given the visibility already in place. I declined nearly all of it. I gave exactly 1 interview, to a financial journalist named Aaron Kessler at a respected business publication, specifically because Aaron's angle was not the wedding drama itself, but the underlying fraud pattern. And I used that interview almost entirely to talk about investor protection, about the specific red flags people should watch for when a relative or close family friend solicits investment, about how shame keeps fraud victims silent, and about resources available through the SEC's Investor Protection Division and through legitimate forensic accounting consultation before, not after, money changes hands. I mentioned my family only in the amount of detail necessary to establish context. I did not narrate the wedding itself for that piece. I have never, until choosing to tell this story now, narrated it in full detail publicly, and I want to be honest that even now I am doing so carefully, aware of exactly how much of it belongs to me to tell and how much belongs to people, my parents especially, who did not choose to have their private pain become public content, and who I have tried, throughout, to protect as much as the truth allows. My mother, for her part, found the public attention almost entirely bewildering rather than validating. She does not use social media beyond a Facebook account she checks to see photos of a former coworker's grandchildren, and when a neighbor showed her, well-meaning but tactless, one of the more widely circulated versions of the wedding footage on a phone screen in her own kitchen, she watched perhaps 30 seconds of it before asking the neighbor to stop, quietly, and later told me, that same night, that she found it disorienting in a way she couldn't fully articulate, like watching the worst night of our family's life turned into something people eat popcorn to. I understood exactly what she meant. I have felt some version of that disorientation constantly since. The gap between what an event actually was, textured, specific, full of small human moments like Harold Pruitt gripping my hand or Susan's cookies on a kitchen table, and what it becomes once it's compressed into 30 seconds of vertical video with a dramatic caption, stripped of every part that made it real rather than merely entertaining. I want to also be honest about a complicated feeling I have carried since, which is that some part of me, a part I am not entirely proud of, did feel a genuine satisfaction watching Patricia Cole's face when 3 of her charity boards quietly declined to renew her seat, watching Brooke's platform collapse before it launched, watching Vanessa's follower count drop by 2/3 within a month. I have spent time in therapy specifically examining that satisfaction, and Dr. Reyes has helped me understand that it is not, in itself, something I need to be ashamed of, that watching people who spent years operating with total impunity finally experience proportionate social and legal consequence is not the same thing as cruelty, that the two feelings, justice and vindictiveness, can look identical from the outside and still be meaningfully different on the inside, provided you are honest with yourself about which one is actually driving your choices in the moment they matter. I believe, having examined it as carefully as I know how, that the choices I made, the timing of the exposure, the decision to fold loop A and loop B together, the specific location I chose, were driven primarily by a desire for accountability and protection of my parents and the defrauded investors, not primarily by a desire to humiliate Vanessa or Patricia for its own sake. But I will not pretend the humiliation, once it happened, felt like nothing to me. It felt like something. I have simply chosen not to let that something become the story I tell myself about who I am. I want to tell the Seattle case in more detail, the one I mentioned briefly, because I think it demonstrates something important about what changed in how I approach this work after my own family's collapse, and because the woman at the center of it, a marketing director named Priya Chandrasekaran, gave me permission, once her case concluded, to share the broad outlines, with names changed for the people who did not consent to be identified. Priya came to Harrow and Vance in February, 6 weeks after my group formally launched, referred by a former Harrow and Vance client who had heard about the new practice area through, of all things, the same business publication interview I had given about investor protection. Her situation had a shape I recognized instantly, uncomfortably, the moment she laid it out across the conference table in our Chicago office. Her uncle, a man named Vikram, had spent 3 years building what he described as a specialty coffee import business, sourcing beans directly from small farms in Ethiopia and Colombia, promising investors, Priya and 4 of her closest friends among them, returns tied to specific shipment contracts that, Priya eventually admitted, none of them had ever actually seen documented in writing, because Vikram was family, because questioning family felt disloyal, because he remembered everyone's birthdays and showed up for every holiday, and made all of them feel, individually, like the person he trusted most. I recognized every piece of that shape. I told Priya in our first meeting something I would not have known to say with this much conviction 18 months earlier, before my own case, that the reason she and her friends had not questioned Vikram more closely was not stupidity, it was a specific, well-documented vulnerability that fraud specifically exploits. The vulnerability of trusting emotional proximity as a proxy for financial credibility, and that the single most important thing she could do now was stop being embarrassed about that vulnerability long enough to act on protecting herself and her friends before more money moved. We moved quickly, faster than my own family's case, in part because I had, by then, built out a genuine process rather than improvising one alone at a kitchen table at midnight. Within 5 weeks, my team had traced a fund diversion pattern strikingly similar to Marcus and Daniel's. Investor money routed through a shell entity, redirected toward personal expenses and prior investor payouts, though smaller in total scope, roughly $310,000 across Priya and her 4 friends, rather than the million-plus my brother's case eventually totaled. Because Priya came forward early, before Vikram had fully dissipated the remaining investor funds, and because we were able to hand a clean, well-documented file to law enforcement within 2 months, rather than the 4 months it had taken me working alone, the outcome was meaningfully different. Vikram was arrested within 6 weeks of our referral, before he could move or hide remaining assets, and a court-ordered asset freeze preserved enough of the remaining funds that Priya and her friends recovered. In the end, just under 90% of what they'd invested, a genuinely rare recovery rate in cases like this, achieved specifically because early reporting preserved assets that would otherwise have been spent or hidden. Priya called me the day the final restitution transfer cleared, in July, almost exactly 1 year after my own family's wedding, and said something that I have carried with me since as a kind of quiet, private validation of the specific, unglamorous choice to keep doing this work, rather than walking away from it once my own case concluded. I keep thinking about what would have happened if I'd waited another year, like you did, out of loyalty, out of not wanting to be the person who blew up the family. I don't think we'd have gotten any of this money back. You didn't just help me get restitution. You helped me not have to carry this alone for years before I finally said something, the way it sounds like you did. I did not correct her characterization of my own timeline, though it was not quite that simple. 4 months is not years. But I understood what she meant, and I let her have that understanding, because it was, in its essential shape, true enough. I think about Priya's case often, alongside my own, because it clarified something for me that I could not fully see while I was still inside my own investigation. The actual lesson of everything that happened is not really about vengeance, however satisfying certain individual moments of it undeniably were. The actual lesson is about the specific, quiet damage caused by silence maintained out of misplaced loyalty, and about how much of that damage is preventable, not through cynicism, not through refusing to trust family or the people you love, but through building enough financial literacy, enough willingness to verify rather than simply believe, and enough freedom from shame, that when something starts to look wrong, however painful the person attached to it might be to question, you say something before the pattern has years to compound. I want to spend some time on my parents' new house, because it has become, over these 11 months, the physical location where I feel most clearly how much has actually shifted, in ways that are smaller and slower than a courtroom verdict, but, I think, ultimately more important. It sits on a quiet street in a suburb 11 minutes from my own apartment, a single-story ranch house with 3 bedrooms, one of them, unofficially, mine, kept ready with a bed and a dresser my mother insisted on furnishing, in case you ever want to stay over. No reason, just in case. A sentence that means something different now than it would have meant 2 years ago, before either of us understood how much I had been quietly absorbing on my own for most of my adult life. My father spends most mornings now in a small workshop he built in the garage, working on furniture restoration, a hobby he'd mentioned wanting to pursue for at least a decade but had never made time for, always saying there was something more urgent to attend to, some bill, some worry, some version of Daniel's life that needed managing from a distance. He restored an old rocking chair last spring that had belonged to his own mother, sanding it down over 6 patient weekends, and gave it to me for my birthday in June with a note that said only, "For when you finally let yourself sit still long enough to use it." I keep it in the corner of my living room. I have, admittedly, not sat in it nearly as often as either of us would probably like, old habits being slower to unlearn than 11 months of good intentions can fully overcome, But I look at it most days and I think about what it means that my father spent 6 weekends of careful, patient labor building me something whose entire purpose is rest. A concept neither of us had ever really made room for in our relationship before that terrace in Maui forced the whole family to slow down and actually look at each other. My mother volunteers now, twice a week, at a financial literacy nonprofit in the city. A connection I made for her after my interview with Aaron Kessler led to an invitation to speak at one of their events. An invitation I initially planned to decline until my mother, unprompted, asked if she could come with me, and ended up, almost by accident, talking for 20 minutes with the nonprofit's director about her own experience nearly losing her retirement to a loan guarantee she never fully understood. A story that resonated so directly with several of the women in that organization's outreach programs, many of them in their 60s and 70s, navigating financial exploitation by relatives or predatory contacts, that the director asked her, on the spot, whether she'd be willing to come back and share it again, formally, as part of their programming. My mother, who spent 26 years answering phones at a pediatric dental office and had never, in her entire life, imagined herself as someone with something instructive to say to a room full of strangers, has now spoken at 11 of their sessions. She told me after the third one that it was the first time in her life she'd felt like her worst experience had actually been useful to someone besides her own family. A sentence that undid something in me every time I think about it, because it captures, better than almost anything else from this entire year, what I actually wanted out of all of it, underneath the money, underneath the accountability, underneath even the protection of my parents' retirement. I wanted the pain to mean something beyond itself. I wanted it to be useful, not just survived. I visited Daniel again 3 weeks ago, my third visit since his sentencing began. He looks different now, calmer in a way that unsettles me slightly, the specific calm of a person who has stopped performing confidence because there is no longer anyone in the room whose opinion he needs to manage. He's working, inside the facility's structured programs, toward a certification in financial literacy education, an irony neither of us has directly addressed but that sits between us, unspoken, every time the subject of his post-release plans comes up. He asked me, during that last visit, whether I thought Mom and Dad would ever fully trust him again, and I told him honestly that I didn't know. That trust rebuilt after something like this is not a single decision, but 1,000 small, consistent choices made over years, and that the only thing within his control was making those choices consistently enough, for long enough, that the question would eventually answer itself. He nodded, and then he said something that I have chosen to hold on to as evidence, however incomplete, that something real shifted in him through all of this. I used to think the goal was getting back to how things were before. I don't think that anymore. I don't think I want to go back to being that guy, even if I could. I do not know yet whether that sentence will prove true over the years it will take to test it. I have decided, for now, to let it be possible. I want to talk about James a little more, because the relationship that started so tentatively in February has become one of the more genuinely stabilizing forces in my life since the wedding, and I think it's worth explaining why, specifically because it connects back to everything else I've described about the difference between being needed and being seen. James proposed in June, on the anniversary of our first real conversation rather than anything more traditionally romantic, on the same balcony where I'd first told him the full story of my family, and I said yes without a single second of the hesitation I had genuinely expected to feel, given everything I had just spent a year watching happen to a wedding, a marriage, an entire family structure built partly on performance. We are planning our own wedding now, for next spring, and I want to be honest that the planning process has been, at times, strange and complicated, in ways that have nothing to do with logistics and everything to do with the specific hypervigilance I have developed around the question of who gets invited, who pays for what, and what promises get made out loud, in front of witnesses, versus what promises get quietly, conveniently forgotten once the harder work of following through arrives. My mother cried actual tears of relief rather than the performed kind, when I told her that my parents' flights to our wedding were already booked, first thing, before venue, before catering, before anything else, an order of operations I insisted on specifically and deliberately, a small, private correction to a wound that had nothing directly to do with James, but everything to do with the year that came before him. James's own family, it turned out, unassumingly wealthy in a way that had never once been performed the way the Coles performed theirs, mostly quiet Midwestern engineers and teachers, welcomed my parents with a warmth that had no undercurrent of condescension in it at all, and I remember watching my mother at a dinner with James's parents in April, laughing easily, unguarded. In a way, I had not seen her laugh around in-laws in longer than I could remember, and feeling something settle in my chest that I did not have a name for until Dr. Reyes gave me one in our next session. Relief that was not about accomplishment or vindication, just relief that my mother, finally, in her late 60s, got to sit at a table where nobody was measuring her worth against a bank account. I think, if I am honest, that the entire experience with Daniel and Vanessa taught me more about what I actually want in a partner and in a family than anything I could have learned by simply getting lucky the first time around. I do not think James and I would have moved as quickly or as clearly toward the life we're building now if I had not spent 4 months learning, in the most brutal way possible, exactly what it costs to build an entire identity around performance rather than substance, and exactly what it feels like on the other side, watching that performance collapse in real time, in public, in front of everyone who had once been fooled by it. I chose someone whose family does not perform. I chose someone who, when I told him the worst thing I know about myself, the specific, complicated satisfaction I felt watching Patricia Cole's face when her charity boards quietly dropped her, did not flinch or moralize, just asked me, gently, what that satisfaction had taught me about what I actually need going forward, which turned out to be a far more useful question than either judgment or blind approval would have been. I want to return, before I close this out completely, to a question a viewer asked me once, in the comments of that one interview I gave, a question that has stayed with me longer than almost anything anyone said to me directly during that entire year. Someone wrote, underneath the video, "How did you stay so calm through all of it?" I would have exploded the moment I heard that comment about swimming to Hawaii. I did not respond publicly, because the honest answer felt too long and too complicated for a comment section, but I want to give it here, fully, because I think it matters more than the mechanics of the fraud itself, more than the specific numbers, more even than what happened to any of the people involved. I stayed calm because I had spent 34 years training, without ever consciously choosing to, in exactly this skill. The skill of holding enormous feeling perfectly still while I figured out what to actually do with it. I want to be careful not to present that as purely admirable, because it is not, entirely. That skill was built out of a specific, quiet cost, the cost of a childhood spent absorbing pressure so visibly fragile people around me. My father after his heart attack, my mother in her instinct to protect Daniel, my brother in his own fragile, performed confidence, never had to fully feel the weight of consequences landing where they belonged. I do not think that skill is something I would recommend anyone build deliberately. I think, if I could go back, I would want a version of my younger self who learned to say, "That hurts me," out loud, in real time, far more often than she actually did, rather than filing everything away into a folder, literal and metaphorical, to be dealt with later, alone, with precision instead of protest. But here's what I do think is worth taking from all of this, if you've made it this far. The version of me who calmly said, "Okay, understood," to a woman who had just suggested my parents swim across the Pacific Ocean to attend their own son's wedding, was not calm because she did not care. She was calm because she had already, in that exact moment, decided that this particular hurt was not going to be one more thing she simply absorbed and let disappear into the general, unexamined ledger of things her family quietly tolerated to keep the peace. Calm, in my experience, is not the absence of feeling. It is what feeling looks like once you have decided, fully and finally, to act on it rather than simply survive it. If there is a lesson in any of this, and I have turned this question over more times than I can count over the past 11 months, it is not really about vengeance, however cathartic certain individual moments genuinely were. It is about the specific, corrosive cost of silence maintained in the name of keeping a family, or a marriage, or any relationship looking peaceful on the surface, when underneath, someone is quietly absorbing the full weight of what everyone else refuses to look at directly. My family looked peaceful, from the outside, for 34 years. It was not peaceful. It was simply well managed by someone who had never been asked whether she wanted the job. I think about my father's sentence often, the one about how Danny was the one everyone worried about, and I was the one they never had to. I understand now that being someone your family never has to worry about is not, in fact, a compliment disguised as a burden. It is a burden disguised as a compliment, and the two are easy to confuse for exactly as long as the person carrying it keeps deciding, every single day, not to put it down. I put mine down on a terrace in Maui, in front of 206 guests and a raw bar staffed partly by federal agents in borrowed uniforms. And I have spent every day since figuring out what it means to build a life where I do not have to pick it back up simply because someone I love needs me to. I want to go back one more time to the exact walk from my chair to that small stage on the reception terrace, because I have never fully described the physical sensation of it, and I think it matters more than any of the strategy or planning that came before. The terrace was warm, the specific damp, salted warmth of a Hawaiian evening cooling slowly after sunset, and I remember the feeling of my heels on the wooden deck, each step deliberate, counted almost without meaning to count them, 14 steps from my chair to the small riser where the band leader stood. I remember the smell of the raw bar, brine and citrus, mixing with the peonies from the ceremony arch that had been repurposed as table centerpieces, $412 a stem, still fragrant hours later. I remember the exact texture of the microphone in my hand, colder than I expected, slightly damp from the humidity, and the specific weight of 206 faces turning toward me in the half second after the band leader announced, into his own separate microphone, "The bride's new sister-in-law has a few words," a sentence he delivered with easy, professional warmth, having no idea what he was actually introducing. I remember, most vividly of all, the feeling in my chest in the 3 seconds before I started speaking. Not fear exactly, though there was fear in it, but something closer to the specific vertigo of standing at the exact edge of an irreversible decision. The same feeling, I imagine, that a diver must feel in the half second after leaving the platform, when the decision to jump has already been made, and the only thing left is the falling. I thought, in that 3-second window, about my mother's voice on the phone in June, cracking slightly as she explained the flights. I thought about Susan Pruitt's cookies on a kitchen table in Fountain Valley, a plate she'd insisted on setting out for a woman she'd never met before who was about to tell her whether her retirement savings were gone forever. I thought about my father's face at that kitchen table in Dayton, asking only, "Are you sure?" trusting me completely with something that terrified him. And then I thought, with a clarity that has stayed with me since, as the truest thing I have ever felt in my own body, that I was tired. More tired than I had let myself admit, even to Rosalind, of being the only person in my family who had to be sure about anything. I started speaking. The rest, you already know. I want to describe the sentencing hearing in more detail too, the one in June where Daniel's 18-month sentence was formally handed down, because it was, in its own quiet way, as significant to me as the terrace in Maui had been, just entirely without spectacle. Federal Courtroom 4B in downtown Los Angeles holds maybe 60 people in its gallery, and on the day of Daniel's sentencing, it was perhaps a third full, mostly attorneys and a handful of the defrauded investors who had chosen to attend, Harold and Susan Pruitt among them, sitting 2 rows behind my parents and me, close enough that I could hear Susan's quiet, steady breathing throughout the proceeding, the breathing of someone who had waited a long time for a room like this to exist. Daniel was permitted, under the plea agreement, to make a statement before sentencing, and I watched my brother stand at a podium in a suit that hung slightly loose on his frame and speak for almost 6 minutes without a single trace of the practiced charisma I had watched him deploy at 100 prior gatherings. He apologized to each named victim individually, using their actual names, not vague collective language. A specificity Rosalind told me afterward she believed had genuinely helped the judge's assessment of his sincerity. He apologized to our parents last, and his voice broke, actually broke, on the sentence, "I let you both believe protecting me was the same thing as loving you, and I let my sister carry the weight of that lie for years because it was easier than facing what I actually was." My mother cried through that entire 6 minutes. My father did not, but he gripped my hand hard enough that I could feel his pulse through his palm. Fast, uneven, the specific rhythm of a man working very hard to hold something together in a room full of strangers. The judge, a measured, unhurried woman named Judge Renata Alvarez, spoke for almost 10 minutes before pronouncing sentence, addressing not just the legal elements of the case but something closer to its emotional architecture, noting, in language I have returned to often since, that fraud committed within families and close social circles carries a particular cruelty because it weaponizes the exact trust that makes human relationships bearable, and the harm it does extends well beyond the dollar figures in the restitution order, into the capacity of victims to trust anyone again, a cost this court cannot fully price but must not ignore. She sentenced Daniel to 18 months, followed by 3 years of supervised release, restitution as ordered, and notably a requirement that any future business venture involving outside investment be subject to independent financial oversight for a period of 5 years following his release. A condition Rosalind told me was unusually specific and had almost certainly been influenced by the thoroughness of the documentation I had originally compiled. Evidence detailed enough that the court felt confident prescribing exactly the kind of external check that had been missing the first time around. I want to say a little more about Gerald Cole, Vanessa's father, because his arc through all of this surprised me more than almost anyone else's, and I think it's worth including precisely because it complicates the neat, satisfying shape this story might otherwise have. Gerald reached out to me again in the spring, almost a year after the wedding, not through Vanessa or any mutual contact this time, but directly. A brief, careful email asking whether I would be willing to meet. Purely, he said, because he wanted to understand what had actually happened inside his own family's finances. Separate from Vanessa and Patricia's version of events, which he described, with a bluntness that surprised me, as mostly focused on how embarrassing it all was, rather than what actually went wrong. We met at a diner in San Diego, a deliberately unglamorous choice on his part that I noticed and appreciated. Gerald told me, over coffee neither of us really drank, that the year since the wedding had forced him to look, for the first time in his marriage, at exactly how much of the Cole family's visible wealth had been performance rather than substance. A reckoning that had started with his own marina business, which he'd finally allowed an outside accountant, not me, someone independent, to review properly for the first time in 9 years, uncovering inefficiencies and near-term refinancing risk that Gerald admitted he had been quietly avoiding confronting, because looking closely felt, in his words, too much like admitting I'd built the same kind of house of cards I was so relieved my daughter hadn't married into. Except I had, just slower, and with better landscaping. He and Patricia separated in March, a separation he described, carefully, as not really about Daniel or the wedding directly, more like the wedding finally gave us a reason to admit things that had been true for a long time before that. He asked me near the end of that meeting whether I thought people could genuinely change once they'd spent decades operating a certain way, the same question, in different words, that I have asked myself constantly about Daniel. I told him what I've come to believe, provisionally, after everything, that change is possible, but it requires the specific, uncomfortable act of looking directly at the cost your previous way of operating imposed on other people, not just on yourself, and that most people, given the choice, will avoid that look for as long as they possibly can, because it is genuinely, viscerally painful, and only a smaller number, when finally forced into it, actually do the harder work of sitting with that pain long enough to let it change something. Chloe Renner, the wedding coordinator, sent me a message in January, almost 6 months after everything happened, through a professional networking platform, brief and formal, thanking me for handling things the way you did, saying she understood now that the alternative, being exposed publicly and unprepared, rather than given the chance to give a voluntary statement, would likely have destroyed far more of her professional future than what actually happened. She mentioned, briefly, that she was doing compliance work now and that the irony was not lost on her, a phrase that made me smile, genuinely, the first time thinking about that entire piece of the story had produced anything other than a tightening in my chest. I did not respond at length. I wished her well, and I meant it, in the specific limited way you can mean well towards someone whose worst mistake intersected briefly and painfully with your own family's worst year, without either erasing what she did or refusing her the possibility of building something better afterward. I think, taken together, these smaller aftermaths, Gerald's slow, painful reckoning, Chloe's quiet pivot, Daniel's uneven, uncertain progress towards something that might eventually be real change, matter more to the actual meaning of this story than the single dramatic moment on that terrace, however much that moment is the part everyone wants to hear about first. Consequences, real ones, the kind that actually change how a person moves through the world afterward, rarely arrive as a single clean event. They arrive as a long, uneven, often invisible series of smaller reckonings that happen mostly in diners and therapy offices and quiet phone calls, long after the cameras, if there were ever cameras, have moved on to someone else's spectacle. There is one more session with Dr. Reyes I want to describe before I close this out, because it clarified something I had circled around for almost a year without quite landing on directly. It was in late July, close to the 1-year anniversary of the wedding, and I had spent most of that session talking, somewhat disjointedly, about the strange mixture of pride and grief I still felt whenever I thought about that terrace. Pride in what I had built, grief for what it had cost, and confusion about why. A full year later, with Daniel in a facility and my parents' retirement protected, and the investors receiving restitution, and my own career flourishing beyond anything I'd expected, I still sometimes woke up at 3 in the morning with my heart pounding, replaying the exact sound of Vanessa's laugh through that speakerphone. Dr. Reyes asked me, gently, what I thought that 3 a.m. replay was actually about, since the danger, whatever danger there had been, was long since resolved. I sat with the question for a while, and then I said something I had not consciously articulated before, even to myself, that I think some part of me is still waiting, even now, for someone in my family to ask me the question nobody has fully asked yet. Not my mother, not my father, not even Daniel in his most vulnerable moments in family therapy. The specific question of what all of this actually felt like from inside my own body. Not what I did, not what it accomplished, not even what it cost me in the practical sense of sleepless nights and legal fees and a year of my life spent building a case against my own brother, but simply, directly, how it felt, moment to moment, to be the person who had to carry all of it alone before anyone else even knew there was anything to carry. Dr. Reyes did not answer that question for me. She asked me instead whether I had ever asked myself that question directly, out loud, in a room, the way I was implicitly asking my family to ask it of me. I had not. I sat with that realization for the rest of the session, mostly in silence, and I have sat with it many more times since, and I think, if I am honest about what I actually want you to take from this story beyond the mechanics of fraud and forensic accounting and calculated exposure at a wedding reception, it is this: that the people who hold everything together quietly, competently, without complaint, are not doing so because it costs them nothing. They are doing so because somewhere along the way, often very early, often without anyone meaning any harm by it, they learned that asking to be seen, asking someone else to carry some of the weight, asking the question, how does this feel for me out loud, was less safe or less welcome or simply less available than simply becoming extremely good at carrying it alone. If that is you, if you recognized any part of yourself in my mother's quiet $40 a week, in Susan Pruitt's cookies on a kitchen table before delivering news that could break a family financially, in my own 11 minutes of silence in a parking garage before deciding, calmly, precisely, exactly what I was going to do about it, I want you to hear something I wish someone had said to me clearly, directly, years before that terrace in Maui ever became necessary. Being the strong one is not a diagnosis of your worth. It is a role someone at some point decided to give you, usually without malice, usually because it was convenient, and roles, unlike diagnoses, can be renegotiated. It took me 34 years and a federal fraud investigation against my own brother to learn that. I hope it takes you considerably less. I want to describe one more concrete scene because I think the abstract reflections mean more when they're anchored to something specific, and this one happened just 3 weeks ago, close enough to now that it feels like the right place to end the accounting of what changed. My parents hosted a small dinner at their new house. The first real gathering there since they moved in. Just the 4 of us who remain closest. My parents, James, and me. Plus, joining by video call from the facility for the first hour. Propped on an iPad at the end of the table, the way families now do these strange, mediated versions of togetherness, my brother. My mother had cooked a full meal, the kind she used to only make for holidays, and she had set an extra place at the table, physically, a plate and silverware, for Daniel, even though he was appearing only as a screen, a gesture that struck me as almost unbearably tender when I first saw it, and understood what it meant. A mother insisting on making room at her table for a son who was, in every practical sense, absent, because the alternative, treating his chair as simply empty, felt to her like a kind of erasure she was not willing to perform even symbolically. We talked for that first hour about small things, mostly my father's furniture restoration, James's work on a bridge retrofit project downtown, my mother's upcoming 12th talk at the financial literacy nonprofit, Daniel's progress toward his certification, and at one point, unprompted, my mother turned to the iPad and said, "Danny, I want you to know we're proud of the work you're doing in there." Not instead of being sad about everything. Both things are true at once. I watched my brother's face on that small screen do something complicated, gratitude and shame, and something that might have been the beginning of forgiving himself, all at once, and he said quietly, "Thanks, Mom." I needed to hear that. The call ended after that first hour, the facility's supervised video window closing on schedule, and there was a silence at the table afterward that was not entirely comfortable, but was, I think, honest in a way our family dinners had rarely managed to be before any of this happened. After the call ended, my father raised his glass, unprompted, and said something that I have thought about constantly since. A short, simple toast that captured, better than anything else from that entire year, what had actually changed. To not pretending things are fine when they're not. It took us longer than it should have to learn that, and it cost more than it should have, but I'd rather have this table, honest and a little sad sometimes, than the one we used to have, where everybody smiled and nobody said anything true. My mother cried, the good kind this time, and James squeezed my hand under the table, and I looked around at the three of us sitting in that small, honest house 11 minutes from my own apartment, and I felt something I had not fully felt in longer than I could remember. Not triumph, not vindication, just the quiet, unglamorous relief of a family finally choosing to look directly at each other, after decades of looking carefully away. I think about Vanessa sometimes still, on nights when I can't sleep, wondering whether she has found anything like that same honesty in the years since, whether Patricia's isolation has cracked open into any real self-examination, or simply calcified into resentment, whether Brooke has found some quieter, more sustainable version of being seen than the performance she'd built her whole identity around. I do not know the answers to those questions, and I have made peace with not knowing, because their reckonings, whatever shape they eventually take, are not mine to manage or witness or narrate. I gave up managing everyone else's reckonings the moment I picked up that microphone on a terrace in Maui. That, more than the money recovered or the sentence handed down or even the promotion that followed, might be the truest thing this entire year actually gave me. Permission, finally, at 35 years old, to let other people's consequences belong entirely to them. I want to close with one final piece of the story, something that happened just last week, because it connects everything back to where this began, and I think sets up something I haven't fully processed yet myself. Harold and Susan Pruitt invited me to their granddaughter's college graduation, a small gesture that moved me more than almost anything else that's happened since the wedding. An invitation extended not because I was owed anything further, the restitution process was long since underway on its own legal track, but simply because, as Susan put it in the card, "You gave us back more than money. You gave us back the ability to trust that someone would actually look, and we wanted you to see what that made possible." Their granddaughter, a young woman named Mia, is starting a job in September at a nonprofit that provides free financial literacy education to first-generation college students. A career choice, Susan told me, with tears in her eyes, was directly shaped by watching her grandparents go through everything that happened, watching them learn, late in life, that financial vulnerability is not shameful, it's just underprotected, and that protecting it is work worth doing. I sat in that graduation audience, a stranger to almost everyone there, and watched Mia Pruitt walk across a stage to receive a diploma, and felt something settle into place that I had been circling for the entire year without quite landing on. That the actual shape of justice, real justice, rarely looks like the dramatic moment on the terrace, the microphone, the federal agents in borrowed catering uniforms, the viral footage. That moment mattered. I'm not diminishing it. It was necessary. It protected my parents. It stopped further harm. It gave 9 defrauded investors a path toward recovery they would not otherwise have had. But the actual, lasting shape of justice looked more like this. A young woman in a cap and gown walking toward a career built out of her grandparents' worst year, because someone had finally looked closely enough at the numbers to say the truth out loud, in a room full of people, at exactly the moment it could no longer be quietly absorbed by the person who had been absorbing everything, alone, for far too long. I don't know what happens next fully. Daniel has 10 more months in his sentence, then years of supervised release and restitution payments, and the slow, uncertain work of figuring out who he is without the version of himself that collapsed on that terrace. My parents are building something new and more honest in that small house 11 minutes from mine. James and I are planning a wedding that will, I promise you, involve flights booked for every single guest before a single flower is ordered. My work has expanded into a specialty I did not choose so much as it chose me. Born out of the worst 4 months of my life, now protecting other families from the exact pattern that nearly cost mine everything. And Vanessa, if you're somehow watching this, wherever you are now, I want you to know I don't wish you ruin. I wish you the same thing I eventually gave myself, though it took me 34 years and a federal investigation to find it. The ability to look directly at the cost of the life you've built and decide, honestly, whether it was ever actually worth what it took from the people standing quietly at its edges, waiting, the whole time, simply to be seen. The next video I'm going to show you is a different case entirely, one involving a family trust, a missing inheritance, and a stepmother who thought forensic accountants only worked for other people's families. If you've made it this far into my story, you've already proven you're the kind of person who needs to know how it ends. So go ahead and hit subscribe now, because you're clearly not the type who leaves a story unfinished, and neither am I. Before that next story, though, I want to leave you with the numbers, because I'm an accountant, and numbers are how I make sense of things that would otherwise be too large to hold in my chest all at once. $1,112,400 in documented fraud, across 9 investors, 5 years of quiet, isolated shame, before the earliest victim ever said a word to anyone. 18 months for my brother, 32 months for his partner. $0 recovered for the years Susan and Harold spent believing their retirement was simply gone, until it wasn't. 90% recovery for Priya Chandrasekharan's uncle's investors, because she came forward in weeks instead of years. 14 family therapy sessions and counting. 11 talks given by a woman who spent 26 years at a dental office front desk, believing she had nothing instructive to offer anyone. 2 visits, then a third, then a fourth, to a federal facility, watching a brother slowly, unevenly, become someone I am cautiously willing to trust again. 1 rocking chair, sanded over 6 weekends, sitting in the corner of my living room, still mostly unused, still meaning everything. And 1 sentence, 4 words long, spoken by a woman who genuinely believed nobody who mattered was listening. If they want to go, they can swim there. 4 words that, once they finally reached the ears of the one person in that family who had spent her entire life being underestimated, specifically because she never let anyone see what she was actually capable of counting, turned out to cost considerably more than 4 plane tickets ever would have. My parents flew business class to that wedding, in the end, on tickets I bought under a fake vendor name so my mother would never feel the weight of owing anyone anything. They will fly business class to my wedding next spring too, tickets already booked, first thing, before the venue, before the flowers, before anything else, because I have learned, finally, at 35 years old, that the people who matter most don't get asked to swim for anything, and the people who suggest otherwise, eventually, one way or another, find out exactly what it costs to be underestimated by the person doing the math. There's a detail I left out until now, deliberately, because I wanted to end with it. The morning after the wedding, before any of us flew home, before Rosalind's final calls with Agent Whitfield's team confirmed the shape of what would come next, I walked down to the beach below the resort alone, just before sunrise, the way I used to walk before work back in Chicago when a case was keeping me up at night. The tide was low and the sand was covered in small, pale shells, the kind that wash up in clusters after a storm, and I found myself crouching down, almost without deciding to, picking up one shell after another, turning them over, the same automatic, careful scrutiny I bring to every ledger I've ever reviewed, looking for the ones that were whole, unbroken, worth keeping. I filled my pockets with maybe a dozen of them before I noticed a resort employee a few hundred feet down the beach, raking the sand smooth for the morning's first guests, erasing, methodically, every footprint from the night before, every trace of the chaos that had unfolded on the terrace just above us 12 hours earlier. I remember thinking, watching him work, that this was probably the truest image of what recovery actually looks like. Not a dramatic reveal, not a courtroom verdict, not even a family dinner with an extra place set for someone appearing only on a screen, but this. Someone, patient and unhurried, smoothing the ground back into something walkable, one small section at a time, fully aware that the tide would only bring more debris back in by evening, and choosing to do the work anyway, because the alternative, leaving the wreckage visible forever, helps no one, least of all the people who have to keep living on that beach. I kept those shells. They sit now in a small glass bowl on my kitchen counter in Chicago, 12 of them, unbroken, and every time I catch sight of them, usually while making coffee, half awake, not thinking about any of this on purpose, I remember that morning, the low tide, the quiet, methodical raking of sand, and I think about how much of what actually matters after a story like this happens in exactly that kind of unglamorous, patient, repetitive work, long after anyone is watching, long after the video stops trending, long after the courtroom empties out. My family is not fixed, not in any permanent, finished sense. We are, all of us, still out there most mornings, raking the sand, picking through the shells, choosing, again and again, on ordinary days nobody else will ever see, whether to keep doing the quiet work of becoming people who tell each other the truth. I think that's the only ending this story actually has. Not a clean one, just an honest one, continuing, one low tide at a time. If you're still here, if you sat through all of it, the tickets, the ledger, the terrace, the sentencing, the rocking chair, the shells in a bowl on my counter, I want to say one more thing before this cuts to black. People are going to tell you after a story like this that the lesson is about revenge, about how satisfying it is to watch entitled people finally face consequences, about how good it must have felt to hold that microphone. Some of that is true, and I've been honest with you about the parts of it that were. But if that's the only thing you take from this, I think you've missed the actual point, which is smaller, quieter, and considerably harder to turn into a viral clip. Somewhere in your own life, right now, there is probably a version of that $40 a week my mother was quietly setting aside. A small, private sacrifice you've convinced yourself is simply the cost of keeping the peace. I am asking you, gently, the way I wish someone had asked me a decade earlier, to look at it directly, just once, before it becomes something you have to build an entire investigation around to finally set down. That's it. That's everything I have to give you about that summer, about that terrace, about a sentence 4 words long that turned out to cost a family considerably more than 4 plane tickets. Wherever you're watching this from, whatever room, whatever quiet corner of your own life you carried into this video, I hope some part of it stays with you longer than the algorithm intended it to. Because in the end, that's really all any of us are doing, family or strangers, protagonists or footnotes in someone else's story. Quietly deciding, one ordinary morning at a time, whether we're the kind of person who keeps count, or the kind who finally, calmly says the number out loud. I chose to say it out loud. I would choose it again every single time, even knowing everything it would cost, because the version of me who stayed silent was never actually free of the weight. She was just carrying it in the dark, alone, where nobody, not even the people who loved her most, could ever help her set it down. So comment your city, tell me where you're watching from tonight, hit like before you scroll away, and if any part of this felt like your own family, even a little, subscribe now, because the next story starts the moment you stop scrolling, and trust me, you'll want to already be here when it does. Don't just watch and scroll past like it didn't cost anyone anything real, because somewhere tonight, another quiet person just like I used to be is doing the exact same math I once did, alone at a kitchen table, deciding whether the piece is actually worth what it's costing her. Go check on her. Or better yet, if it's you, go check on yourself tonight, before another year quietly passes and you're still the only one holding the number, still doing the math alone at some kitchen table nobody else can see, still deciding, every single morning, whether the piece is actually worth what it's costing you. Take care of the people quietly holding your world together, before life forces you to notice all at once, on a terrace, in front of everyone. It's cheaper that way. It's kinder too. The next story starts the moment you stop scrolling, so don't stop yet, because the family trust, the missing inheritance, and the stepmother who thought forensic accountants only worked for other people's families is already loading right there on your screen, and this one starts with a number even bigger than $940,000, and it starts with a woman who, unlike Vendetta Cole, actually knew exactly who she was talking to when she picked up the phone and lied straight to my face anyway. You've already sat through mine start to finish, which tells me everything I need to know about whether you're going to stick around for hers too. So go ahead and subscribe now, before the screen cuts to black and you lose the thread entirely.